What's up guys, this is your favorite fanfic YouTuber, the Fanfic Majesty, and welcome to another amazing video. You can follow me on Patreon for exclusive stories. 16 et. Chapter 531 Terrible Tony. Advertisement. In room 1609, metal moving back and forth under Eric's control withstood several attacks, killing a tattooed beast. Snort. The woman laughed softly. Children are children, and they dare not kill. Substitution. At this time, Eric and Charles stopped each other at the same time. The woman was stunned and annoyed. In the next second, Charles used superpowers to control the woman in front of him. In an instant, there were no predators and poisonous beasts in the room. Eric waved his hand, and the metal turned into a chain, restraining Walker. Waking up, Walker looked at the scene in front of him and screamed. Charles only took one look, and made the woman lose her balance. It wasn't until Eric repaired the metal chain with great effort that the two of them looked at the man named Walker. Who are you? Walker calmed down and looked at the two children in front of him expressionlessly. Oh, those children caught by you say hello to you. Eric grinned, his palms tensed slowly, and the metal chains on them jingled slowly. Ah, the man cried out in pain, what the hell are you talking about? Still installed. A trace of hostility flashed in Eric's eyes, and the metal chain tightened even more. Noticing the change in Eric, Charles held out his hand and said, I'll do this and he'll have no secrets from me. Eric staggered back, thinking for a moment, and the chain let go. Who? Walker gasped for breath, he almost thought he was going to die. The guy almost strangled him. However, these two boys are very powerful, If you can control both of us, will you be rich? The voice in my head was spoken directly by Charles. Everything in Walker's mind was turned upside down, and he looked at Charles in surprise. Charles smiled and said, good idea, but you won't have this chance. As soon as the voice fell, the invisible spiritual energy rushed towards the interlocutor, broke into his mind, controlled him, and searched for the information he needed. In room 1610, no. Advertisement. With a terrified expression on his face, Tony, who was stripped off, screamed, rolled off the bed, and hurried to the corner. Don't run, you're naked, you're like a beast. How are you? A female killer without a coat slowly walked towards Tony, holding a gleaming dagger in her hand. But Wani was more startled by another deep bayonet in another woman's hand than by the dagger in the woman's hand. Damn it. What exactly is going on? Looking at a big man who was more delicate than a woman, but a big boy who may be older than him, Tojong was terrified. He even thought that he just understood the past. He thought of Hazashi. Vomit. He almost threw up. The big man tensed his nerves, looked at Tony expressionlessly and said, I'm going to kill you. Tony took a deep breath, got up from the ground, wrapped the towel around his waist nonchalantly, and said, why did you kill me? Why did you kill me? What do you want? Do you want money? How much do you want? 100 million? Or a billion? There was a hint of excitement in the big man's eyes. But then he shook his head. Said, kill you. Then you'll have to pay a lot of money. Then tell me, who wants to kill me? Tony said, while taking a step back. Think about who you've hurt lately. The big man licked his lips. There was a sneer at the corner of his mouth, and he stared at Tony unscrupulously. A series of lists flashed through Tony's mind. But nothing came out. Because there are so many of them. When will you die? I can have fun. The smile on the big man's mouth is wider. He has the habit of dissecting targets. He wanted to use his special penchant for mourning to get some money from Tony, and some money from Tony, and some more money. Now it seems that things have become sadly simple again. Hearing the interlocutor's words, Tony couldn't help shivering, and scenes of youth appeared in his mind. So terrible. At this moment, the big man suddenly took a step forward, and the weapon in his hand turned into a cold light and pierced Tony's neck. Tony took a step back, but Biggie kicked him in the chest, sending him flying. The pain in his chest was unbearable and he couldn't cooperate. He hasn't learned how to fight yet, and has spent so far in the laboratory. If I can get out alive this time, I must learn fighting skills. Tony grinned ferociously, staring at the big guy, who walked towards him with his mouth open. Go to hell. The big man snorted coldly and rushed towards him. Tony screamed, turned and ran, then grabbed the bath towel around his waist, and threw it at the opponent's face as a hidden weapon. 0 for flowers. 0. Advertisement. Taking this opportunity, he stepped decisively towards the door, pushed it open, and sprinted out, while the second man tore off the bath towel and tried to catch up with him. Just then, the door opposite Tony's room was pushed open. Tony's eyes lit up, and the sun hit the two Charles who had already come out of the house. Both Charles looked blank, while Tony turned quickly and was about to close the door. But just as his hand had time to grab the doorknob, a hand appeared and grabbed the door. Run. Tony slammed the door open and collided with another man who was yelling at Charles and Eric. Charles and Eric got up from the ground, stared at Tony in confusion, their eyes dimmed, and they took a few steps back. Uncle, are you not only annoying, but also a pervert? Milkman pervert. 0. Both couldn't help but jumped up. The corner of Tony's mouth twitched when he said, come on, someone is going to kill me. You didn't pay anyone. Aren't you a third party? The two little girls started gossiping. Oh, go to hell. Prepared mentally, he roared and rushed towards the big man. Tony was kicked in the chest and rolled around on the floor in front of them. Tony stood up. After a while, he pounced on each other and let the two imps escape quickly. The big man came in, closed the door behind him, looked at Tony with a smirk, and followed Eric's gaze. Remember, those 2 children died because of you. Boom. In any case, these 2 little ghosts cannot be allowed to die because of him. Looking at each other's backs, Eric and Charles were stunned and could not help but narrow their eyes. In the next second, the door of the dead end was pushed open instantly, and Tony ran out, not forgetting to take Charles and Clark with him. Oh, you can't escape. The 2 fell silent, and said in unison, Uncle, you have too many bacteria. Tony grabbed Charles and Eric, his pale face was full of bitterness, ready to erupt at any time. With a sneer, it took almost a second for him to approach them, and the dagger in his hand plunged into Tony's chest fiercely. Indeed, extinguishing the gas is a bit stressful. Enough. I'll stop him, you guys run. Tony swore that if he couldn't spare his hand at this moment, he would definitely teach these 2 boys a lesson. I don't know who these 2 brats learned from. Advertisement. Chapter 532 Too Stupid. Advertisement. Tony's eyes narrowed, and just when he thought it was over, 2 laughs sounded behind him. The next second, the dagger stopped and plunged into his chest. Purple drops of blood oozed from the punctured skin and rolled down to Tony's chest. Tony's heart was beating wildly. Then he came to himself, breathing heavily. Not dead. He looked at the big man standing motionless in front of him in surprise, and couldn't help taking a step back. What happened? Before he could figure it out, several pieces of metal flew towards him, entangled his hands and feet, dragged him, and nailed him to the wall. Tony was stunned, then seemed to remember something, and turned to look at Eric and Charles. It's you. He looked at the 2 smiling people with surprise in his eyes. Charles and Eric wisely pretended not to understand, 467, and asked with confused eyes, what happened? Tony glared at them. You guys are so fake. Ah, found out. Then shut them up. The 2 sang in unison. Tony looked at the 2 men, strangely tense. The 2 of Charles looked at Tony for a long time, and then their eyes sparkled. Do you think you are in good shape? Uncle Pervert. Tony came back to his senses and hurriedly covered his crotch with both hands. Stupid. Isn't it time to cover your face? Tony. Benefits. He ran to the door, opened it, carefully looked into the corridor, turned and said to the 2 men, don't go. As soon as the words fell, he ran to the opposite room with wild steps, quickly got dressed, and ran in again. Hey, you 2 brats. Tony, who was dressed, looked at the 2 of them, and his tone became masculine unconsciously. Advertisement. That, thank you, just now. If it weren't for these 2 brats, he might have kept his face cold. To be honest, until now, when the dagger was inserted into his body, he didn't even think about his own death, thinking about the headlines of the next day. The handsome Tony Stark, the boss of Stark Industries, a genius scientist, was stabbed to death. The scene was bloody. Upon inspection, it seems that something indescribable happened to him after his death. Hiss. He couldn't help but gasped, looking at the 2 people standing in front of him, he suddenly became angry from embarrassment. It's not just saving lives, it's the rebirth of parents. I don't have a grown son like you. The corner of Charles's mouth twitched inexplicably. Tony. Huh, what did he say? Eric got a little impatient. Please, erase his memory, we still have someone to save. Erase memory. Tony was startled, and took 2 steps back. Hey, why don't we live and die together? There's no need to erase memories, right? He quickly looked around and found that the room was in chaos as if swept by a hurricane. Then he remembered that the 2 had said they wanted to save people, so he hurriedly said, besides. Save people or something, I can help too. Hearing this, both Charles and Eric were stunned. They looked at each other and nodded. Where do these kids need to live after they're rescued? Need to contact their families. With how rich this guy is, it's a lot easier than they are. Charles quietly used his ability to check Tony's inner thoughts at the moment, and then his attention was attracted by Engie's bad image. But when he found out that all the actors were Tony, he hurriedly pulled himself out of Tony's thoughts. How? Is he believable? Eric asked Charles in a low voice. Charles nodded and said, really, besides, is he the son of the old man who came to find his father before? If he dares to break his promise, can we tell father? Let the old man get into trouble. After hearing what the 2 said, Tony was stunned. Does the old man know the father of these 2 children? Hey, so we've known each other for a long time. After making a decision, both of them nodded to Tony, and Eric said, we promised to help you, but will you tell us about us? Speak out. Why do you do that? Does it do me any good? Tony asked nonchalantly. Of course not. Hearing this, Charles nodded to Eric. Tony breathed a sigh of relief and said, come on, tell me, how can I help you? Some kids. Advertisement. Charles opened his mouth and told Tony about the children. Hearing this, Tony nodded and said casually, this is a good idea. After saving people, I will let the company take over. Those who have homes will find them homes, and those who have no homes will be sent to orphanages. 0 inches. Charles and Eric breathed a sigh of relief. Tony looked at the people in the room, found Walker and the woman, and said, is it them? What are you going to do with them? Charles walked up to Walker and said, I'm going to erase his memory of us, get him out of superpowers and turn him into the police. After saying these words, Charles put his hand on Walker's head, quickly deleted the memory of their meeting, and then deleted the memory of the woman, walked up to the big man, and murmured to Tony, boy, help me do me a favor and find out who hired him to kill me. Charles nodded. Seconds later, Charles said, Mr. Vanke. Tony blushed, and cursed softly, Damn, it turned out to be that B asterisk 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 D. Even if he was killed, he also found a pervert killer, which made his task even more difficult. Erasing the memory of his brother's killer, Charles said, Walker needs a touch to disarm him, we have to take him down, but what about these two? Tony said, leave it to me. Tony bent down, picked up a dagger from the ground, and walked over to the unconscious assassin lying on the ground. Charles and Eric bowed their heads. Charles exclaimed in surprise. Moments later, the killer's beautiful blonde hair turned into dog-gnawed lawn. Etc. He took out his mobile phone and called his father. After briefly describing the situation, he said, let's go, professionals will come to pick them up right away. Eric snapped his fingers, and Walker, who was bound by metal, flew towards them and landed firmly on the ground. Hey, uncle, you're not going to kill him, are you? Tony grinned, gritted his teeth, looked at his opponent, and raised his hand. Walk. He stood up and said, I'll wait for you at 3.1. Looking at this scene, I felt a little jealous. Tony scolded and walked to the door. Damn it. Pretend to be a woman. Charles looked at Tony's back, then at the big man, and grinned, but a thought flashed through his mind, should he tell their father about it? As soon as the voice fell, Eric flew away from the balcony. Charles turned to Tony. Advertisement. Chapter 533 Interested. Advertisement. Dozens of children crowded into a dilapidated and dirty house. But after seeing the scene in front of them, Charles's three subordinates rushed over with a heavy heart. Charles controls Walker, disempowering the children one by one. After the black rose disappeared from the children, they regained their freedom. After knocking down the controlling Walker again, Charles used his powers to put all the kids to sleep. After throwing the unconscious Walker to the corner of the room, the three set off. When they saw Tony contacting to pick up the children and Walker's shield, Charles and Eric breathed a sigh of relief and showed their happiness. Smile. Looking at the expressions of the two, Tony couldn't help wrinkling the corners of his mouth, but when they looked at him, the smile quickly disappeared. He raised his chin slightly and asked, how is it? Did you succeed? Charles and Eric nodded. Thank you, uncle, you're not bad either. Tony froze, twisting his body quietly. Come on, uncle. What? Tony looked sullenly at the two tens. Take us back to where we live. Eric squinted at Tony and said, it happens that you have a car, and we have a car too. Hee. Charles looked at Tony with a grin. Tony was momentarily at a loss for words. He was really unlucky today. Not only was a good night lost, it was almost killed, and now I have to drive two small children home. He took a deep breath and said, we can send you back, but you must promise me that you will never call me uncle again. Okay, Grand Master, Tony. For the next 2 days, Charles and Eric were in a good mood, and even the scenery they had seen was different. The spring outing is over and they are going home. When they dragged their luggage to the door of the house, they saw a car parked in front of the house. New car. Dad bought a new car. The two murmured something, and the doorbell walked over. After the door opened, the two smiled at Monk, only to find that Monk was looking at them nervously. Their hearts were beating thumpingly. At this moment, there was a look in Monk's eyes. He looked into the room. I found a familiar person sitting in the living room, and said silently, Dad, I forgot something and I will come back to get it right away. After saying this, the two turned around. Monk grinned, reached out to the heads of the two and said, come in. Oh, advertisement. The two followed in obediently, and carefully scanned the living room. Monk pointed to the three people in the living room and said, call the people here. Grandfather, etc. Monk stopped the two men, pointed at Howard and his wife Mary and said, uncle and aunt. He didn't want to be inferior to this old man in vain. The two called out in good faith. The two exchanged two good-natured smiles. The two of them glanced at Tony and were about to speak when suddenly Tony said hurriedly, just call me by my name. Monk nodded. He said to Howard, wait for me, I'll talk to them first. Howard frowned and said, Monk, don't be too hard on the kids. They're doing good after all. Monk nodded, carrying the luggage of the two of them, and leading them upstairs. Boom. Hearing the sound of closing the door, he laughed behind him and said, old man. Do you think they will be hit? Howard looked at Tony and said, I don't know if they can take a hit, but I want to hit you. Tony laughed and said, you can't say no. Maria Stark couldn't help laughing and replied, just like when you were young. Panting, Howard turned to his wife and said, did I really look that haggard when I was younger? Maria was silent. She nodded affirmatively. Tony. Ha ha ha. Upstairs in Charles and Eric's room. Put your luggage away. Monk looked at the two silently, and they lowered their heads unconsciously. Dad, we did something wrong. As soon as the words fell, listening to Monk not responding, both of them were filled with uneasiness. Head up, Monk said softly. Both of them raised their heads slowly, with terrified expressions on their faces. A look of heartache appeared on Monk's face. He hugged the two of them gently and said affectionately, you did the right thing. Both of them were stunned, with ecstatic expressions on their faces. They had expected Monk to scold them severely. Noticing the expressions on the faces of the two, Monk changed the subject and said, but. Both of them trembled, and hurriedly withdrew their complacent expressions. Monk stretched out his hands, cupped the two people's cheeks, and said in a cold tone, what if you were in danger? Why don't you call me? Advertisement. Eric braces himself. I think we can handle it. Charles nodded and said, yes, I read the kid's memory and realized his abilities. Monk clenched his hands into fists and said softly, "Is there no accident?" Both of them were silent, thinking of the woman who suddenly appeared. Monk hugged the heads of the two and said, "You guys were lucky to deal with the accident this time, but what about next time?" Panic was written on the faces of both of them. Before you learn how to deal with emergencies, you guys have to think a little bit before you do anything, okay? Okay. Monk leaned over and hugged the two gently, and said, "You guys did a good job this time, but next time you encounter something like this, you have to be careful, understand?" Clear. Both of them breathed a sigh of relief. Monk released the two, winked at them, and said, "Friendly reminder. When erasing people's memories, don't forget to deal with surveillance issues." Both of them were stunned. 103 Monitoring. Hotel rooms and corridors. Surveillance in the hotel lobby. There was a flash of understanding in the eyes of both of them. Monk patted the two on the shoulders and said, "Don't forget to thank Uncle Howard when you go downstairs. Don't forget to thank Uncle Howard when you go downstairs, he helped you get the surveillance done." Not only that, but Howard brings both of them out of the story. For that, I want to thank Howard. If it wasn't because the other party, Monk, didn't know about the two children. If I don't bring these two down, I don't know what will happen next time. All three of them went down the stairs. Tony looked at Charles and his wife with regret in his heart. Seeing that they didn't get scolded, Tony snorted in disappointment. Charles and Eric looked at Tony, then at Howard, and expressed their sincere thanks. Howard smiled kindly at the two little guys, and said to Monk who was sitting opposite him, "I'm here today, and besides this, there is one more thing I want to talk to you about." "Huh," Monk said warily, "there won't be any trouble here, right?" "Ha ha," Howard said with a smile, "Of course not." Having said that, "How old are you?" Monk froze. "Ask your age. Are you going to introduce someone to him?" 42 years old. Howard laughed and said, "Want to be Tony's godfather." Advertisement. Chapter 534 No interest. Advertisement. Godfather. Except for the smiling Howard and Maria, everyone in the living room was stunned. Before Monk objected, Tony exclaimed, "Old man, are you kidding me? Godfather. I'm so old, you still let me be godfather." Monk raised an eyebrow, waiting for Howard's explanation. "Tony." Howard suddenly turned his head and turned to Monk solemnly. "Monk, you are a good father." Monk nodded and said, "I admit it." The corner of Tony's mouth twitched, so shameless. "Tony is the same as I was when I was a child. He is a troublemaker and often hurts people." Monk nodded, confirming that. Howard looked at a distraught Tony and said, "So, I don't want him to be sent away to join me right after I die. Are you?" Monk said, looking Howard over from head to toe, unwell. Howard smiled bitterly and said, "Soon." Hearing this sentence, a painful expression flashed across his face. Maria smiled at him and took his hand. Howard exchanged a tender look with him before saying, "I have cancer, it's incurable, and I don't have much time left. I've been using chasing book software recently." "What?" Tony looked at Howard in horror, and smiled dryly. Old man no, Dad. You're lying to me, aren't you?" "That's right." Howard looked at Tony calmly, shook his head and said, "I wish I could, Tony." Tony stared at Howard for a few seconds, finally convinced that he wasn't kidding himself, and sat down on the couch like he had lost his mind. Maria hugged Tony gently, and Howard looked at Monk, waiting for his response. Howard was actually quite happy. If it weren't for Monk, he and his wife would have died 4 years ago, and now he has lived for another 4 years, and he has already taken the step of handing over Stark Industries to Tony. After a few years of carefree life, he no regrets. However, he feels uncomfortable because Tony is so much like him. Although Tony is a genius scientist, brilliant, and recognized by the world, he is arrogant, vicious, arrogant, and narcissistic. He is very clear that such a character is too easy to offend people, and the world is not the same as it was decades ago. Isn't it? He doesn't want Tony to be murdered because of his temper. Although he has great confidence in Tony, he still feels that he should leave an insurance policy for this child. Advertisement. So what? Monk was his favorite. He has outstanding ability, but he is usually very low-key. He is always at the forefront when he needs it, and most importantly, Monk is a perfect father in his eyes. He hadn't met yet a father who could teach his kids superpowers. A father who could teach them to be so obedient. These children, humble and polite, never cause trouble. Of course, never use their abilities to do bad things. Faced with injustice, they will save people regardless of danger. This is much better than what he taught. Did he glance at Tony? Sighed. From the look on Howard's face, Monk could guess what he was thinking. But being Tony's godfather, would it be better to forget about it? He'd be mad. So what? He shook his head and said firmly, "Sorry, I can't take it." Hearing this, Eric and Charles breathed a sigh of relief. Howard and Maria were so disappointed that even Howard couldn't resist interjecting. "Don't you really want to think about it? Tony is an unlikable character, but he's definitely a good guy." Monk had never seen Howard like this, but it could be Dad. Dad. Tony looked at Howard, his mind spinning. He was sent here, and as an adult, this is ridiculous. Howard looked into Monk's eyes and saw that there was no weakness in Monk. The frenzy in his eyes slowly faded, and then he laughed out loud in bewilderment. He seemed to have lost his former composure because of what happened to Tony. Seeing this situation, Monk said, "Howard, you have to have confidence in Tony. He has survived for so long and has not been killed. His survivability is still very strong." Howard nodded, then frowned. This sounds reasonable, but there seems to be something wrong here. Monk continued, but you and I are still friends, Tony, I will take care of you like a friend. Howard finally smiled. Maria replied gratefully. Thank you, Monk, you are an angel. In her eyes, Monk is equivalent to an angel, because he saved the couple. Howard breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that he should give Monk some gifts before leaving, such as a large deposit or stocks or something. Howard squeezed Tony's shoulder and said, Tony, call me uncle when we meet again. Advertisement. Him. The corners of Tony's mouth twitched. He has yet to recover from his father's cancer, yet has another uncle. He was a young man who was almost 25 years old, and was brought by his father to meet his uncle. Etc. He looked at Charles and Eric with some strange eyes. If these two little ghosts call this person uncle, can't they be called uncle? Besides, this guy is over 40 years old, counting his seniority, he seems to be from the uncle generation. Once a person's thinking deviates, there will be an unexpected reversal. When he reacts, he has already made a decision that he regrets for life, and he may be extremely happy. When Tony called him, he froze for a moment, then backed away. He patted Clark on the shoulder and said, accommodating the guests. Not bad. Howard and Maria looked very happy. Clark nodded imperceptibly and smiled. Both of them replied. Charles reached out and nodded, using his ability to connect the two people together, and then told Clark what happened just now, and about his travels. At this moment, Clark came back from school. He looked at the three of Howard in surprise, but he politely greeted them, obtained, and then turned his eyes to Charles and Eric. Squinting his eyes, he asked, are you back? Did you have a good trip? Clark nodded. What the hell did I just yell? What did I just say? For a while it was my father who had cancer, for a while it was Uncle Monk, and for a while it was the two Charles calling him uncle. Monk looked at the clock on the wall and stood up. It's getting late, stay for dinner. Monk walked into the kitchen, quickly prepared a delicious dinner, and then entertained as many guests as possible. When the Howard family was about to leave, Charles took Howard's hand, pulled him aside with a smile, and whispered something to him. Tony's face kept changing. Howard's face suddenly became a little stern, and he walked out with a heavy heart. Dad, is there a guest? Uncle. His mind is a little confused now. Advertisement. Chapter 535 If you. Advertisement. Howard was the last to get in the car and sat in the co-pilot's seat. He looked at Tony, hesitated to speak. Tony knew Howard's expression very well, and he forced a smile and asked, what happened? He still couldn't accept the fact that his father was terminally ill, even though his reason told him it was true, he still didn't want to believe it. I'm sorry, son, for all these years I ignored you and ignored your feelings. The sudden confession of true feelings made Tony stunned, and his heart was pounding. The car started slowly and drove towards New York City. Looking at the seemingly endless road ahead, Tony tried to force a smile. No, Dad, I never blamed you. After all, his father gave him the most awesome growth and life in the world. Although he usually spends little time with his father, as long as he can be together, he will do well. Facing the imminent parting of life and death, the contradictions and estrangement between them disappeared in an instant. Howard nodded, his face still dignified. Tony looked at Howard's face and couldn't help saying, don't worry, old man, I will find a way. Howard smiled and said, if there is a way, I don't have to organize the aftermath. After a pause, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath as if he had made up his mind, then said, Tony, no matter what you do, I will support you. Tony froze for a moment. Then Howard gritted his teeth and said, even if you really don't like women, I agree. After speaking, Howard felt relieved. Tony slammed on the brakes, the corners of his mouth twitching wildly. What are you talking about? Old man, did your cancer spread to your brain? As soon as the voice fell, he reacted and said hastily, well, I didn't mean that. I mean, do you know what you were talking about? Howard nodded seriously, and said, Tony, I already know that the murderer is a man, and you were with him at the hotel. For a moment, Tony felt that he was about to collapse, and an emotion called anger instantly burned in his heart. You call me. Tony was angry. He came to me pretending to be a woman. I didn't know he was a man. Nothing happened that night. Watching Tony wailing, Howard stared at him for a few seconds. Ha 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 ha. He suddenly laughed happily. Tony froze. Advertisement. Howard squinted at Tony and said, how? Scared. Before leaving, Charles told him that the killer was a man, and that Tony jumped onto the street naked. He secretly laughed at Charles's childish narrow-mindedness, while thinking about. In order to control Tony. Knowing that the killer has been captured by their SHIELDs, what is Tony going to do? He already knew. Tony gritted his teeth. You crazy old man. Pause. The father and son and Maria in the backseat couldn't help a friendly laugh. The laughter died down, and Tony turned his head, gripping the steering wheel tightly with both hands. Lips murmured. Dad, is there really no other way? What about hospitalization? Well, Howard said with a wise smile. I don't want to be bald, it's too ugly. After a pause, he continued, as I said, I am very satisfied. I have enough time to tidy up after my death. This is much better than the last time I was almost killed. Tidy up. Tony froze for a moment, then asked, when? Didn't I tell you? Howard asked rhetorically, before saying, before I let you take over the company, the night Monk and I met, he saved me and your mom. Shocked, Tony said, why didn't you say so sooner? What knocked my snot out? Howard clasped his hands together and said, how is this possible? Monk saved his parents, but his son saved me. Realizing this, Tony sighed helplessly and said, Dad, now I don't think I'm in vain for any uncle. Howard patted Tony on the shoulder and said, come on, go home. I'm going to start making the last BOF plans for this trip. Over the past few years, Tony has helped take over the company, and as far as S.H.I.E.L.D. goes, he's done enough. He really doesn't have much time left, he just wants to be with his family and see the world. I'll be with you. Good. In the small town where Monk lives, more than 10 kilometers away from his farm, there is a small river with clear and gentle water. Monk's family often comes here to fish. It's been a while since they last came. It was Sunday, the weather was good, Monk had a whim, he brought tools and a grill, prepared some ingredients in advance, put them in the second pocket, and drove to the river with his 3 children. After hanging the earthworm from the hook and tossing it around, Monk left it alone. Swim down whatever you catch. Hey, you 3, eat whatever you catch today. Advertisement. Monk turned to the 3 with a smile, and the 3 smiled confidently. One of them picked up the fishing rod and started fishing. Fishing is not only dependent on talent, but also luck. After a while, Charles was humming happily and throwing the fish up. Eric and Clark yelled. After a while, they will be able to catch bigger fish. Charles, well done. Monk applauded, and started pulling out his grill. Before he could set it up, Charles cried out in delight and picked up another one. Monk raised an eyebrow and gave Charles a thumbs up. Careless. I should have seen it first. Both Clarks narrowed their eyes and hummed softly. 1, 2, 3. But in the next second, his expression became ironic. Seeing this scene, Monk showed a ferocious smile. Fishing with Charles is like going out to sea to fish. The faces of both of them became gloomy, especially after seeing Charles catch one after another without breaking free. The pressure of the surrounding air also became heavy. Charles put the fish into the bucket with a deadpan expression, muttering, you won't catch anything, you're about to eat farts. Clark grumbled. Suddenly, Clark yelled happily and lowered the hook. Half an hour later, the 2 fishing rods that Monk accidentally placed on the riverbank caught fish, but Clark and Eric still had nothing to catch. Clark and Eric smiled coldly. Monk, who was watching the fun, couldn't help but laugh too. It was a brightly colored female object. Finally, after Charles pulled himself together again, Eric said angrily, you've had enough. You're scaring my fish away. Charles looked at Clark mockingly, and Eric sighed and shook his head in Clark's direction. Clark nodded. Ha ha ha. Advertisement. Chapter 536 You made a mistake. Advertisement. Clark smiled at Charles, walked up to Eric, and the 2 whispered a few words. Looking at this scene, Charles was a little worried. In the next second, 2 people shouted and rushed over and snatched the fish. Looking at this scene, Charles felt the urge to cry. When the 3 of them were fighting, a scent reached their ears, which made them gasp heavily, and they hurriedly picked up the fish. Xiaoji grabbed a handful of mutton skewers, looked at the 3 children in front of him, and for some reason remembered the profession of a breeder. He shook his head, shared the kebabs among them, and said, take a few lucky fish and save them, and let them live. The 3 nodded obediently, and after quickly eliminating the skewers, they began to grill the fish. While Monk was fiddling with the fish, one of them took a few skewers and grilled them. A few minutes later, when Monk had finished the fish and started grilling it, the 3 handed the taut meat to Monk. Monk took it with a smile, turned to Clark and said, Clark, have you ever thought about going to college early? Clark never let him worry about his studies since he was a child. This child has a strong learning ability, he can learn everything at once, and even taught himself all subjects at a very young age, including university. Clark shook his head and said, I'm not interested. I'll just stay in school and go to school normally, just like a normal person. Up to you. Monk took a bite of the kebab, his eyebrows twitching. Dad, what's the matter? Eric asked. It's delicious, it would be better with less salt. Eric grinned. Monk nodded and said, what about you? We are self-study for the time being and don't want to go to college in advance. Charles and Eric shook their heads in unison. Well, you decide for yourself. In any case, in terms of study, as long as the 3 of them are not crooked, he doesn't have to worry too much. At this time, Monk's cell phone rang. Picking up the somewhat bulky mobile phone in his hand, Monk connected the call. Hello, Monk. You were wrong. Monk hung up the phone with a blank expression, and turned off the phone. Advertisement. Dad, who is it? Charles asked curiously. An A*hole, whatever. Oh, shall we go? Let's fry the fish. At the same time, on the other side, on the plane. Nick Fury staring at his phone. Disbelief on his face. He actually hung up on me. In desperation, he pressed the number again, and then heard the message of shutting down the phone. His face darkened even more. Laughing out loud, a woman in a leather jacket sitting in the driver's seat. Watching Nick Fury get beaten, he laughed heartlessly. Nick Fury looked at the woman with a dry smile and said, maybe I called the wrong number, why don't we go see him? He would be very welcome. Welcome. The blonde woman poked Nick Fury maliciously. Really? Didn't you get kicked out? Ha. Ha 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 ha. Nick Fury smiled confidently and said proudly, he will be very enthusiastic, I believe. We are old friends. Pause. He looked at the woman seriously. Trust me, boss. Boss waved his hand and said, who cares? As long as you can find someone who can actually help me. Nick Fury stammered. Don't worry, he can help you, he's the best guy I've ever met. He was impressed by Monk's various abilities, and Monk knew the upper echelon of shield. There is no better helper than Monk. Just finished speaking, he took a closer look at Forsyth and found that the latter was looking at the front seriously, so he breathed a sigh of relief. The woman fell from the sky and crashed into the video room. When he took his rookie partner to deal with him, if the woman hadn't pulled him, he would have been wiped out by the aliens long ago. Immediately afterwards, his rookie partner was quietly replaced by a green-skinned alien. If he hadn't succeeded in counter-killing the opponent, he would have almost been killed again. He watched as his rookie partner transformed into a green-skinned alien. He could swear that if he hadn't seen this ability and saw this scene, he would have screamed like a woman lying in bed for the first time. Then, after tracking Voss all the way, he finally reached a consensus with Voss. He helps the woman find information about her past, while she helps him deal with the green-skinned aliens known as the Skrulls who have invaded Earth and are lurking there. Skrulls can transform into anyone and even retain short-term memories of their targets, making fighting them very difficult. Therefore, Nick Fury dare not trust anyone easily. Hey, Fury, Voss snapped back. What the hell happened to that Air Force base? They drove to Vandenberg Air Force Base to check their identities before calling Monk. Advertisement. Due to the battle with the Black Emperor, 2 years ago, there were heavy losses there, and it is still closed for reconstruction. Ask for flowers. Although it was forbidden to enter, they still sneaked in, but unfortunately found nothing except an orange cat that slipped away with them. The Project Pegasus files they were looking for had likely been destroyed, or had survived, but been moved to a new location unknown to Nick Fury. Not only that, but while they were looking for the files, they were hunted down by the Skrulls, who had become Nick Fury's boss. Luckily, Forsyth messed things up and escaped the base on a plane with Nick Fury. Hearing Forsyth's question about Vandenberg Air Force Base, Nick Fury responded, it was destroyed by Major War 2 years ago. A big fight. Foos had a curious look on his face. Nick Fury looked at Voss. Don't think you are very good, there are many people on Earth who are better than you. 0. Oh, Voss raised his eyebrows suspiciously. Her abilities are unique even among the Kree. You are very observant. At this time, an orange cat with a label crawled over from the back seat and got into Firth's arms. Meow. Nick Fury looked at a smiling Firth with blank eyes and said, you don't look embarrassed. Seeing Nick Fury rolling his eyes boredly, Firth grinned. Let's talk about the battle 2 years ago. 27. Snort. Oh, sorry for letting you see that. Anyway, to pass the time, it's good to hang out and listen to each other's stories. Nick Fury's eyes lit up and he said, hide and seek, you cute little cat, come to me. So, he narrated what happened 2 years ago, but the difference was that he was the protagonist, the hero who killed the big man, beat up the mutants, and trampled the Black Emperor. Better than her. On this backward planet C-53, Nick Fury teases the orange cat and marvels at how cute it is. Firth smiled, apparently accepting Nick Fury's version of the story of the Black Emperor incident. After listening to the story, Nick Fury couldn't help but laugh. Do not make jokes. Nick Fury retorted. You don't believe me? He asked. Nick Fury looked nostalgic and began to say plausibly, 2 years ago, I led our Thunder team. The orange cat nicknamed Goo Goo rolled in Firth's arms, turning a blind eye to Nick Fury. He picked up Goo Goo and put it in Nick Fury's arms. Advertisement. Chapter 537, The Chicken and the Egg. Advertisement. After staying by the river until the afternoon, Monk returned home with his 3 children. If he didn't go home, he was afraid that Clark and Eric would mess up the river, or mess up Charles. I don't know whether Charles was too lucky or too unlucky, they didn't catch a single fish, and Charles would catch one fish every now and then. The catch was good, but in the end Monk had to release most of the fish. They can't finish it. Having said that, as for the fish, he had heard that there were fat and big Asian carp in the river, and he had to go and see them when he got the chance, and turn them into a delicacy. After parking the car, Monk turned around and put away the barbecue tools, and walked towards the house again. Hey guys, any of you are going to the supermarket to buy today's groceries? Looking at the 3 who were still full of energy, Monk stopped them. Clark, Charles, Eric, the 3, 660, pointed at each other, and Monk pushed them aside. The chance to be clean is in an instant. The 3 rode bicycles to the supermarket, while Monk washed up, changed into comfortable clothes, and watched TV in the living room. A Journey to the West. Watching the picture played on the TV screen, Monk was a little surprised. Although this world is very different from the world before time travel, there are still some things that have not changed. Monk watched the fussing monkey fascinated. This is a fond memory of childhood. Just when he was engrossed in watching, a rumbling sound suddenly came from outside. He stood up and turned his head to see that a plane was coming from not far away. Looking at that thing, Monk had a foreboding feeling. Sure enough, 10 seconds later, the plane landed in the open space in front of his house. Monk walked towards the door, but when he reached the door, the footsteps fell silent. After thinking for a while, he went back to the kitchen, picked up a kitchen knife and waved it twice in his hand. Break it down, how am I going to cook? With a sinking heart, he put down the helicopter and used his mental power. A few seconds later, a 3-meter-long ordinary sword slowly appeared in his hand. He nodded in satisfaction, dragged the knife and walked towards the door. Advertisement. Opening the door, he narrowed his eyes. It's him. When he arrived, he happened to see a familiar hairy, golden little brother, alas, blonde and blue-eyed, walking out of the plane. Monk. Looking at Monk standing at the door, Nick Fury was very moved. He said to Faith, "Look, my friend." As soon as he saw me coming, he was already waiting for me at the door. Yeah, Foos watched the expression on Monk's face suspiciously. That doesn't sound like a greeting to them at all, does it? Monk, my friend. Nick Fury spread his arms and embraced Monk. Monk grinned and slowly drew a knife from behind his back as Nick Fury walked up to him. The knife was very long. Monk dragged it slowly. Nick Fury panicked. The footsteps became more and more messy. BCH. It's you again. Monk cursed angrily. The big knife aimed, and Nick Fury quickly rebounded twice. Go away. You are like crows when you come in, nothing good. Monk looked at Nick Fury coldly. The knife in his hand seemed likely to pop out at any time. Nick Fury took another 2 steps back, squeezed a smile, said, I didn't say what's going on. Shut up, I don't want to hear it. The corner of Nick Fury's mouth twitched, and he suddenly said, wait for me, I want to give you a gift. Just finished speaking, he rushed to Fossey and picked Gugu up. He walked up to Monk and said, see if he's okay. Here you go. Monk turned around and said, the cat stays, you go out. Nick Fury casually licks Fossey, pushes the P** side towards Forsyth, pushes Forsyth towards Monk and says, how is she? If you help me, I'll give her to you. As soon as the words fell, before Monk could move, Fu Han elbowed him back. Well, Nick Fury covered his eyes and took a deep breath. If this continues, his eye will be lost sooner or later. Firth suppressed his smile. My name is Firth, and Firth said you can help me. I want to ask you to do me a favor. Firth. Monk looked at the interlocutor, his eyes flickering slightly. Carol Danvers, future Captain Marvel. Advertisement. He recognized him the first time he saw him, but now this person calls himself Forsyth. Does it mean that his memory has not been restored? Carol Danvers shows up and gets involved with Nick Fury, so is this a Captain Marvel storyline? In Captain Marvel's storyline, it ends with Captain Marvel's memory restored and he destroys a Kree battleship, just like in the TV show No Doubt. 0. This is simple and rude, without any danger, and it also sold Captain Marvel a favor, which he may use in the future. Monk thought for a while, nodded and said, what's the matter? Hey. Nick Fury came out from behind Forsyth, squinting, pointing at Monk and said in frustration, why don't you help me when I ask you? You help me when she asks you to help. Monk waved the knife in his hand, squinted at Nick Fury and said, will you explain? Nick Fury shook his head and said, you're happy. Georgie let go of his weapon. When Forsyth saw it, his eyes lit up, and he inexplicably strengthened his confidence, believing that Monk could help. Tell me, what's busy? Monk came out and stood in front of the two of them, clasping his hands together. Recalling some images that appeared in his mind, Voss frowned. I seem to have lived here myself, but I don't remember anything. This card was made in the era when memory editing decks were born, in order to erase some people's memories. I didn't expect it to be used at this time. Monk frowned. Come in, please, it will be time for dinner in a few minutes, I have to leave, please have a meal. 217. Is that so? In the next second, a card appeared in his hand. Nick Fury. Hey, Monk says, things that help you restore your memory. Memory. Forsythia's body tensed suddenly, and scenes appeared in her mind. Forsyth looked curiously at the deck in Monk's hand. Skill description. It can restore the memory of people who have lost their memory. Monk raised his chin thoughtfully and said, it shouldn't be a problem. Remarks. Memory, precious things that cannot be forgotten. Hearing these words, a look of distress appeared on her face. The corner of Fussy's mouth twitched slightly, and he said hesitantly, there seems to be something wrong with my memory, there are many pictures in my mind, but I can't remember any of them. As soon as the words fell, a pink-purple silk thread emerged from Monk's palm, and shuttled into his mind after Forsyth used this card. Nick Fury said, we weren't invited. Title. Memory line flashback. Advertisement. Chapter 538 Fist. Advertisement. Precious, painful, beautiful, profound. All kinds of lost memories came to her like a flood. She bent down in pain, grabbed her hair, the energy in her body surged, and her whole body exuded a dazzling light. Forsyth looked at Monk in puzzlement, dumbfounded, and even said with some trepidation, what did you do to me? What does all this mean? If these memories are true, then her name is not even Firth, but Carol Danvers, she is not even a Kree, she is an Earth person, and she wants to avenge the Kree. So, the very people she swore to protect and fight for all these years, her friends, her star teammates, the enemies who killed her. There was some confusion in her mind, the return of a large number of memories collided with the memories of the past few years, and the two sides were entangled, which made her fall into confusion. She looked up at Monk again, her face twisted, and she said with difficulty, what did you do to me? Monk shrugged and said, it's just that Shaolin brought back memories of your past. Memories of the past. Carol muttered to herself, recalling the images that emerged in her mind. The energy surging all over her body was getting stronger and stronger, and her hands were wrapped in dazzling light. Seeing Carol's current state and feeling the energy of the other party, Monk was secretly surprised. This DK, women are really not simple, 10 is only half of the strength of the other party under the restraint. Carol looked at Monk, who was standing not far from him, and asked again with a complicated expression, "You really didn't do anything? Are those my memories?" She's still a little baffled. If she remembered everything slowly by herself, it would be good to say that she still had a buffer time to accept it, but now she remembered everything all at once, which made her fall into doubt. Doubt yourself, doubt the monk. Monk frowned and said, "If you don't believe me, there's nothing I can do." Full of strength, Carol walked up to Monk firmly, staring into his eyes, trying to find evidence that Monk was lying. Finally, she sighed and was about to thank him when suddenly, boom! With a loud noise, she immediately disappeared from her seat, and she was pushed and flew out. Drive her away. With a loud bang, she was nailed to the ground, leaving a gully of tens of meters and a mound. Her mind was a little dazed, but long-term training. But she was the first to fight back, releasing a burst of photon energy from her glowing hands. The man holding her was thrown back by the impact, but he still hugged her tightly. Opening her eyes, she saw a baby-faced figure, apparently a child, glaring at her angrily. She froze for a moment. Then, she saw a dangerous red light appear in the boy's eyes. A stab in the heart. The rising energy in the body. A shock in the hands. Like a rocket, she flitted across the embankment behind her, breaking free from her opponent's control. But what about the next moment? A man descends from the sky with a clenched fist. Boom. Advertisement. The ground was shaken by the impact of the fist, and mud splashed in all directions like a torrential rain. Carol paused, before she could stand up. When the boy looked in her direction again, she let out a sneer, spit out the dirt in her mouth, untied her hair, then clenched her fist and swung at the boy. Boom. Her fist slammed heavily on the boy's body, and the boy remained motionless. Carol looked up and landed on the boy's chin. Boom. There was an explosion, and light-like energy rushed in all directions. But the boy's head was only lifted slightly, and it was an angry headbutt to her forehead. Boom. Carol fell to the ground, pushed away the opponent's fist, wiped her nose with her hand, and looked at the blue bloodline between her fingers. The energy in her body was ignited. She is angry, she wants to vent, and she doesn't care whether the other party is a child now. But at this moment, Georgie quietly appeared between the two and shouted, "Stop! Stop!" Clark lowered his fist, and Carol snorted coldly, looking at Clark sullenly, like a kid who has lost a fight. Monk pressed his head with one hand and silently put the card back. He just showed up and was terrified that the two men would confiscate it, that one of them would do something to him and tear him down. Fortunately, the strength of these two people is well controlled. "What's wrong with you?" Monk looked at Clark. Clark looked at Carol coldly, and asked, "Dad, didn't she threaten you just now and plan to hit you?" In this scene, Carol's whole body has been filled with terrifying energy, and he is still steadily approaching Monk. All three were silent. From the looks of it, he seemed to be about to hit Monk. With a twitch in the corner of Monk's eye, he said to Carol, "Well, that guy made a mistake." Carol took a deep breath, tried her best to control her out-of-control facial features, snorted coldly, then looked at Clark and asked, "Your son?" Monk nodded. Carol paused and said deeply. Watching this scene, Clark shuddered. The two know each other. Is this woman an old friend of Dad's? If so, it's not good. Will he lose his future mother? Monk glanced at Clark, noticed the changing expression on his face, and said grimly, "Don't even think about it." Advertisement. Clark was stunned, and heaved a long sigh, both disappointed and relieved. "Hey, how are you all?" Nick Fury came running over. "Fine," Carol said softly. The impact on Clark's head woke her up from the sluggishness, and the memories in her brain were no longer scribbled. She looked at Monk and said, "Thank you." Monk nodded, reached out to stop Clark, and said to him, "If you don't mind, just come in and sit down. It's rude for the son to throw someone out just after he punched them." Carol and Nick Fury nodded, and the four headed towards Monk's house. "What about those two people?" 437 Monk asked in a low voice. Clark thought for a moment, then said, "Should be almost there." Monk replied, "Monk, that's the boy. Oh, he's just a little bit stronger." Monk said softly, "Strong. He can't be called a big man anymore, can he? And that horrible speed." Nick Fury glanced at Clark, but when he noticed Monk staring at him coldly, he shuddered involuntarily and smiled ironically. "Fury, I warn you, for Clark's sake, you'd better rot in your stomach." Monk said coldly. A murderous look echoed in the air. Nick Fury nodded solemnly and said, "I understand, he's just a kid." Monk took a deep look at Nick Fury, smiled and looked at Eric and Charles, who were nervously running that way. "Daddy, are you all right? Are they looking for trouble?" Eric frowned and looked at the two of Fury, while Charles's eyes lit up slightly. Monk patted their heads and said, "It's okay, it's just a misunderstanding, let's go home." The two responded, and the four walked home. Looking at the backs of the four, an inexplicable idea entered the mind of Nick Fury, who was following Monk. These two kids. Think of what Clark did just now, think of Monk's ability. He suddenly gasped. If so, this family is truly horrible. Advertisement. Chapter 539. This world. Advertisement. Monk pushed open the door and stepped in. "What's wrong?" Nick Fury, who was following behind him, looked over Monk's shoulder into the house curiously, and asked with wide eyes. A humanoid with green skin and a strong body appears in the living room of Monk's home. Scrooge. Monk walked into the room, followed by the others. The three of Clark looked at the Scruggs with curiosity in their eyes. So Carol walked into the crowd and asked, "What do you want to do?" "I want to talk to you." The Skrull's voice was weak and his eyes were dim. When he saw Clark, his eyes froze, and his eyes became unbelievable when he said, "You." Monk's eyes narrowed. He spoke first, and asked coldly, "Who are you?" The first time he saw Skuru, he recognized him as Talos, the leader of Skuru. In the original plot, this Talos has seen through that the orange cat is a gene phage. And now the other person's expression is that Clark recognized him. Monk was taken aback. If so, this is very, very important news for him. The Skrull was stunned, with cold sweat on his forehead, looking at Monk's murderous eyes, he felt a terrible sense of threat. "I have no malice, I am a Skrull, and I want to invade Mr. and I apologize, my target is the woman beside me, I have to ask her for help, you can call me Talos." The Skrulls have the ability to reincarnate, they observe the target, and then become the target, and even briefly flip the target's memory, so their family has a keen sense of danger, and he is one of the best. With the ability to reincarnate, they will also become different races, and Clark recognizes each other at the first sight. Hearing the interlocutor's words, 2 cards appeared in Monk's hand. With a flash of his body, he appeared next to the interlocutor. When he pinched the interlocutor's neck, the cards suddenly dissolved and turned into dots of light. In the next instant, they disappeared in front of everyone. How is this going? Seeing this scene, everyone looked at each other in blank dismay. With a flash of light, Monk appeared in a strange place with Talos. Monk let go of his opponent, and Talos took 2 steps back. Looking at the river in the distance, he widened his eyes and secretly marveled at the ability Monk showed. His face was a little ugly. He said, "What do you mean?" Quote. Monk looked at each other, smiled, said, "Relax, I don't even need to bring you here if I want to kill you." Talos breathed a sigh of relief, but remained vigilant. "Just how?" Monk said, "You recognize Clark as the big black-haired kid, right?" Not an interrogative sentence, but an affirmative sentence. Advertisement. Talos thought about it. He nodded. Monk muttered, "I want to ask you something." "Say it. Who is he?" "You mean his race?" Talos asked cautiously. Monk nodded. Talos said, "Kryptonians." Hear that? Monk sighed inwardly. Because of the system, he was still wondering if Clark was arranged by the system. Would Clark be the only Kryptonian in this world? Now, he was sure of it. Krypton exists in this universe. What confuses him is that there is no such thing as Gotham City or Metropolis on Earth. After years of research, he finds out that there is no Batman, Wonder Woman or other superheroes. What about this? He didn't know if these people hadn't appeared yet, or if they didn't exist in this world at all. Personally, he prefers the second option. After all, if they really lived in this world, it would be impossible not to leave traces. Now that Krypton is here, does that mean a small part of that universe has merged into this world? How much did it merge? Monk is not yet sure of this. Talos watched the change of Monk's face, guessing the relationship between Monk and Fu Xing. Monk then proceeded to ask, "Where is Krypton?" "Krypton is outside the galaxy and has been destroyed." Talos sighed. "They are rarely active in the Milky Way. If I hadn't been wandering in the universe and looking for our home, I would not have known the existence of Krypton. After Krypton was destroyed, it would be even more difficult to see Kryptonians. That's why I was so surprised when I saw your son." Monk nodded, breathed a sigh of relief again, sighed thoughtfully, and continued, "The last question, how did you recognize Clark?" "You know, Clark looks exactly like the people on Earth." Talos grinned. "This is the talent of our Skrulls." Talos thought vaguely. "In our perception, each race will give us a different feeling, and we can record the feeling of the race we changed." A sense of talent. Monk felt relieved and said, "Thank you for your answer." As soon as the words fell, a deck of cards appeared between his fingers, and he said, "Let's go back, please remember, the things I asked you and Clark must be kept secret." Advertisement. "Wait," Talos yelled hastily, looking at Monk nervously, "can you please say something nice to that woman for me? I had some bad times with her before." "All I can do is make sure she doesn't do that in my house," Monk said with a smile. Talos said with relief, "Thank you." He believes that if they don't fight immediately after meeting, he will be able to persuade the interlocutor to help him recall what happened before. Monk squeezed Talos' shoulder and teleported back home again. When they got home, Carol was sitting on the sofa drinking juice, Eric and Charles were watching TV, and Clark and Nick Fury were talking about something. There was silence in the room when the 2 monks quietly appeared. "Dad, just now," Clark asked suspiciously. Monk said, "I'm going to ask Talos something, and stay away from Fury." Nick Fury made an innocent expression, and muttered, "Is there anything you need to ask? From the look of you, it seems that you want to kill him." Talos looked at Carol and said, "Maybe these things remind you of something." Instantly, Nick Fury became even more depressed. Monk glanced at Nick Fury and said, "Can you shut up?" Talos froze. Talos nodded. "You are only a 3rd-level agent, too low." Nick Fury rubbed his hands. "Can you two explain to me? I don't know what's going on now." "Wow, this information still exists. Where did you find it? How did I not know?" Nick Fury was a little surprised. Talos froze for a moment, then smiled. "It couldn't be better." Nick Fury spread his hands. The corner of Nick Fury's mouth twitched. Talos' transformation target was his superior, and the level was indeed higher than him. She grinned and clenched her fists. A flash of anger flashed in her eyes. "The Kree lied to me. At this time, Carol put down the empty wine glass, looked at Talos and said, I just have something to say. I just have something to say to you. Carol stood up. I regained my memory and remembered what happened that year. Monk looked at Nick Fury in disgust. Why are you still a third-level agent? So he said. Using my browsing ability, Liano Zhao found the recording you received and some information about you. Things went even better than he had imagined. Things were calmer than he expected. Advertisement. Chapter 540 I don't have a son like you. Advertisement. After a few minutes, Carol and Talos fell silent. Simply put, the Kree invasion sparked a war with the Skrulls, and the Skrulls were in trouble. Their homeworld was invaded, and their people were scattered to every corner of the galaxy. Since the Kree were the invaders in this war and the Skrulls were innocent, Marvel as a Kree thought it was an unjust war, so he took refuge with some Skrulls on Earth and hid with his own identity. He became Drive. Wendy Lawson on Earth, and founded the Pegasus Project. Using the energy core of the Rubik's Cube, he wanted to develop a light-speed engine to help the Skrulls find a new home. In the end, the light-speed engine was successfully developed, and it was discovered by the Kree during Carol's test flight. The fighter plane was shot down, and the Surprise was destroyed by the Kree. When she woke up, she found that she came to Hara, the home planet of the Kree, and forgot her own memory, and became a member of the Kree and the Star Warrior. She didn't recover her memory until she returned to Earth after performing the mission. After the description and conversation between Talos and Carol, Carol also realized who the victims of the Skrulls were. She remembered the words of her most respected Doctor Strange and decided to help the Skrulls regain their energy core universe Rubik's Cube, to help them find a new home. Talos received a string of numbers, which he mistook for the coordinates on the Earth, and wanted Carol to help them decipher the coordinates of the Surprise laboratory, but these numbers were actually the state vectors used to determine the orbit and route, that is the laboratory is revolving around the Earth, and they can't find the laboratory on the Earth at all. The energy core is in the Marvel labs, and they must get it as soon as possible, because Carol's former teammates, the Kree, are also looking at it, and it will arrive on Earth soon. We must act quickly, the hooligans from Kaguya will arrive soon. As soon as Carol finished speaking, the audience fell silent. Nick Fury said, so we need a ship to take us into space. Talos said, my people can modify your planes. Ah, Uncle Greenia, how did you come to Earth? Where is your spaceship? Charles asked curiously. Talaska to Carol. Carol turned her head to one side in embarrassment, seeing Nick Fury looking at her panting. She snorted softly and said, BAAC, then. They were still enemies. Everyone was taken aback. That's right. Monk knocked on the table. When everyone gathered looked in his direction. He said, have you guys finished your discussion? Let's go. Talos and Carol nodded, and Nick Fury said nervously, aren't you coming with us? Why should I go with you? Because, Nick Fury exclaims, if you're there. Then I'm relieved that you're reliable. Advertisement. Get out. Monk stretched out his hand, pointed to the door and said, get out. Laughing out loud. Ha ha. A burst of laughter erupted from the crowd. At this point, Clark gently pulled Monk closer to him. Whisper in his ear, Daddy's got a boat coming our way and it's going fast. Monk's heart was pounding. How did things happen so fast? He should have kicked these people out sooner. Glancing at Nick Fury, the corner of Monk's mouth twitched slightly, because he found the reason. Yongmu has been following Carol. Carol and Nick Fury spent a lot of time looking for the Pegasus project. If they follow the original storyline, they can find information at the Air Force Base, so they don't need to look for it. As a result, the two ran a long way and wasted a lot of time to come here to ask for his help, and Yuki happened to be on the Earth at the time, so he flew directly to his side. It's all the Black Emperor's fault. If he hadn't made a mistake in releasing the virus at Vandenberg Air Force Base, the base would not have been destroyed and shut down, the information would not have been passed on, and if the information hadn't been passed on, Nick Fury, the B***************** D, wouldn't have will bring Carol to him. If they don't come to him, there will be no problems later. A series of thoughts flashed through his mind quickly. Mark frowned with a headache, and said to the three of Carol, it's too late, a space plane will arrive soon, if I guess correctly, it should be you said the brave Rogs. Talos was taken aback, and a wry smile appeared on the corner of Carol's mouth. Fury jumped up like an electric shock and said, what should we do? What should we do? How about we escape by plane? Carol looked at Nick Fury and asked, have you ever flown an airship? She was sure she could take care of Jan Roeg and the others, but... Carol thought. Yang Zhao is not difficult to deal with, but he has a whole fleet of accusers behind him, and reinforcements may be sent at any time. This is what makes her headache and worry. Nick Fury looked at Monk subconsciously, and Carol and Talus also looked at Monk with bated breath. Monk. What do you see me doing? I know you have a way. Nick Fury made a very positive evaluation. Advertisement. Monk gasped and said, I'm not your father, so you don't have to call me every time you need something. Nick Fury. Daddy. Monk. He looked at Nick Fury and said, you should be ashamed of yourself. No. The corner of Monk's mouth twitched wildly. I don't have a son like you. Well, Talos said awkwardly, do you think he'll be all right? Carol watched this scene, and patted her forehead in confusion. Who are these teammates? She turned to Monk and said, if you have a way, please help, we will do it ourselves. As soon as the words fell, all three looked at Monk. Monk replied helplessly, do I have a choice? Brave Roger is now targeting his family. And he did have a way to deal with the Fornian robbers, and it was very simple. Monk muttered to himself, looked at Charles, and when Charles looked at him, he patted his forehead. Charles's eyes lit up when he heard the signal, and he used his ability to connect the two of them to each other. Dad, do you want me to draw a picture? As Charles jumped up, Monk's voice came from inside his head. Monk replied. In a split second, you can control them, but don't pretend you do. Pack. Charles was even more excited. Monk. Okay, just do what I say in a minute. New. Before they could finish their words, in the night, an airship roared and landed in the open space in front of Monk's house. Advertisement. Chapter 541. Simplicity and Change. Advertisement. Brave Rogue. The captain of the Carry Star Troopers has powerful fighting skills, and he can crush Carol with his fighting skills alone. In addition, he also has a defensive device on his arm, which can emit strange energy and can be used to control things. All in all, he's pretty strong, even among the Kree, but not strong enough for Carol. Carol could call him a referee with one punch if he wanted to. Moreover, after investigation, it was found that there are still a group of people on the Earth called mutants who have magical powers, which is also a threat to them. He is very self-aware, so the Accuser's fleet is waiting for him not far from the Earth. As long as Carol dares to resist, the Accuser's fleet will pour missiles at her and blow up the city to pieces. He believed that with Carol's personality, such a thing would never happen. When the airship landed, he organized a sniper named Minerva to ambush the airship before leading the others to Monk's home. But to his surprise, as soon as he approached, the door opened. Carol came out alone. Noticing Carol's expression, Little Rascal smiled lightly and said, Worth, I think you remembered. Worth. Carol replied with a contemptuous smile, my name is Carol Danvers. It's okay. Yonggear didn't care. He looked towards the door and said, call all your friends, Skell, call all your friends Skrulls and Earthlings. Carol's hand lit up. The corners of Yang Mang's eyes twitched. He raised his hand and pointed upwards. If I don't report upstairs within 3 minutes, the town closest to us will be hit by missiles. If you don't obediently follow us, you will too. Hit by a missile. Carol smiled and said, I guess I have no choice. Brave Rogers spread their hands. At this time, Carol grinned and said, I may not be able to do it. I may not be able to do it, but my friend has it. Quote. The brave Horns was startled. Before he could speak, his body lost control, and even his thinking was suspended, making him unable to think anymore. The next moment, the teammates around him fell down one by one. Seeing this scene not far away, Minerva was startled. She pointed the muzzle of the gun at Conqueror. When her finger was about to press the trigger, the muzzle of the gun in her hand twisted suddenly, directly restraining him. He grabbed her hands, and then hit her head twice with, dong dong dong. It knocked her out. Seeing this scene, even Carol, who was mentally prepared, was stunned. This ability is too strange. At the same time, Monk praised Charles and Eric in his heart, saying, Charles. Control this man, let him inform the fleet to leave, and tell them that the matter is settled. Understood, sir. Charles shouted with a playful smile, looked outside curiously, but secretly controlled brave Little Rascal to turn on the communication, and then gave orders to the fleet outside the alien Earth. After receiving the order from the Horn of the Brave, the prosecutor fleet set off without hesitation. Advertisement. Seeing this scene, Carol opened his mouth wide. This is too simple. Oh, yes, Nick Fury exclaimed happily, raising his hand to Talos, wanting to high-five his opponent. Talos looked at Nick Fury suspiciously and asked, what do you want to do? This is embarrassing. Nick Fury raised his left hand again, clapped his palms together, and said to Talos, at this moment, you should cheer for me. Talos nodded, looked around at the crew on the starship, and cheered. He turned to look at Monk and nodded gratefully. Monk smiled weakly, and said to Charles in his heart, go to hell with the last one too. Why? Charles did. In an instant, the headache problem was solved so easily. It's like a dream. Nick Fury sighed. Sure enough, Monk is reliable. He looked at Monk silently and gave a thumbs up. Moments later, the Space Marine is bound by the 3 Carols and thrown into the ship. Nick Fury looked at the small alien spaceship, touched the cockpit, and exclaimed, wow, wow. While they were still considering getting Talos, scientists to modify the plane to go into space, the enemy sent the spaceship in time. Thank you, Monk. Standing in front of Monk's house, Carol thanked him again. Monk waved his hand and said, hurry up. Carol smiled and threw it at the spaceship. Talos bows to Monk and says, thank you for your help. Zero looking for flowers. Monk waved his hand casually. Talos turned and ran after Carol. Meow. Goo Goo ran out of Monk's house, rubbed Clark's leg, and ran after Carol. Advertisement. Phew. Monk sighed and said, those troubles are finally gone. The 3 of Clark also heaved a long sigh, and said to Monk, Dad, it's time to cook. Ha ha. Monk laughed and said, it's dry rice, dry rice, dry rice. And just as he turned to go home with his arms around the shoulders of the 3 children. Well, a figure fell to Monk's feet with a bang, and let out a painful groan. It's Talos. Monk was puzzled. At this moment, Nick Fury let out a howl, was knocked into the air by an energy bomb, spewed blood from his mouth and rushed towards Monk and the others. Ji Xiaofan, who had just run away, ran back to Monk's house with a meow. Clark couldn't dodge and caught Nick Fury. Nick Fury spit out a big mouthful of blood, and a large crater visible to the naked eye formed on his chest. At this moment, light spots appeared in Monk's hand, and the cards were scattered all over the place. Rejuvenate. A green light enveloped Nick Fury. But that's not enough. Another card fell apart, and a gold-green glow appeared around Nick Fury. Title: Star Infusion. Skill description: restores the target's health and heals damage. Remarks: voila, nanny power. In an instant, Nick Fury's damage stabilized, and he began to recover continuously under the effect of the rejuvenation technique. After thinking for a while, Monk took out another card, and a rejuvenation fell on Talos. Feeling the pain subside quickly, Talos was secretly startled, and said to Monk, "Be careful. Something is wrong with Carol." Without him talking, Meng also noticed. At this moment, Carol's whole body was shrouded in pale golden photon energy, and she walked out of the spaceship with a cold face. As this under control, Monk frowned. With a painful expression on Carol's face, she jumped and shouted, "Quick! It's the highest intelligent body." In the next second, Carol took control of the spaceship again and slowly walked towards Talos, and the spaceship behind her also started and took off into the sky. Advertisement. Chapter 542 Father and Son Double Body. Advertisement. The Supreme Mind is the life computer created by the Kree, the god of the Kree, and the actual leader of the Kree Empire. It has many powerful functions such as mind control and high-speed computing. That's right, mind control. In the original storyline, after Carol Danvers was captured, the highest intelligence used the tools on the spaceship to pull Carol into the mental field, mocked her, and tried to use Carol's previous fail. The memory came to attack and taunt Carol, trying to make her give up resistance completely. But to his surprise, under the rage, Carol miraculously gained all his power, destroyed the power suppressor on his body, and completely broke free from the opponent's control, destroying the accuser's fleet. At that time, the Supreme Wisdom perfectly explained what it means to be infallible. So, Carol is controlled by the Supreme Intelligence, and this spaceship is the key to controlling Carol. If there is no 797 to have this spaceship, the Supreme Intelligence as a life computer will not be able to transmit its own power, and Carol's control will be released instantly. Monk watched the airship fly away, his eyes flashed, and two cards appeared in his hand. Name: Clark Kent. Character description: Kryptonian, the righteous and compassionate superhero Superman. Note: never wear underwear on the street. Monk faces Clark day after day, how could he forget him? This is a card based on the prototype of Clark in Iron Man. Although it is not the pinnacle of Superman's power, it is also very exaggerated. And once materialized, it can last for a minute. You can do a lot in 1 minute. After using the first card, the second card in Monk's hand dissipated and turned into a spot of light. Title: Shadow Transfer. Skill description: an entity doppelganger with a consciousness independent of the master's body and a certain ability to resist blows. Note: Shadow Clone technique is sure to appeal to time management gurus. After using Shadow Clone, Monk's power is split in two, but it's enough for now. At the moment when Monk's body and Carol's body met, the shadow double rose into the air and chased after the spaceship. Watching this scene, Clark's three eyes opened wide. It's amazing. Dad became daddy's daddy. Boom. Carol, who lunges at Talos, is blocked by Monk. Advertisement. Boom. With a crisp sound, the photon energy points scattered around. Carol looked at Monk coldly, and blasted out two energy bands with both hands, knocking Monk into the air. The Monk stopped, their house left behind. He breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, he didn't crash. In the next moment, Carol's whole body was enveloped by photon energy, like a ruthless machine, as if she had turned into a beam of light and shot towards Monk. As soon as Monk lowered his body, was he going to meet him? Clark made a bang, hit Carol, knocked him out. Monk stared at Carol dumbfounded. Carol rushed out, and he jumped into the air while still in the air, and chased after him. Then there was a bang. Right there, Carol flew away. At the same time, Clark disappeared in situ. Jumping with both feet, the body flew, and then the hands clenched into fists. Slammed into Carol's body hard, smashing her from the air to the ground. There was a sound like a slap. Carol fell from a high altitude like a golden meteor, smashing a big crater on the ground. Looking at this scene, Nick Fury swallowed his saliva. Talos looked at each other. They all took a breath of air at the same time. This is terrible for father and son. Carol got up from the ground, shook his head, and hurriedly raised his hand to block Monk's fist falling from the sky. Boom. Accompanied by the golden light spots, the shock waves generated by the explosion roared. The ground under Carol's feet was scattered with a lot of mud, and her body crashed into the mud like a nail. Ah! Clark emerged from behind Carol, grabbed one of Carol's arms with both hands, and twisted it behind her back, and Monk grabbed Carol's other arm almost simultaneously, twisting it behind her. For a moment, the father and son were crushed by Carol. Photon energy burst out from Carol's eyes, and this energy spread throughout her body like substance, enhancing her strength, and she began to struggle violently, but to no avail. As long as Carol's power is limited and she cannot exert her full potential, she will not be able to break free from the control of the father and son, but after accumulating all her power, Carol will break free from the control of the Supreme Intelligence again. For a while, Carol, who was controlled by the Supreme Intelligence, faced such a predicament. 0. Advertisement. Ah! She let out a roar, and a huge energy burst out from her body, like two rivers of energy, and rushed towards the father and son. The energy river swept over them, turning into a V-shaped explosion behind them, completely evaporating a large amount of crops, and even the ground became clearly visible. Looking from a distance, it seemed to spread a pair of light wings. But the father and son remained motionless. Except that the clothes on the upper body were instantly vaporized, there was no scar on his body. This is hopelessness. Fortunately, the mood didn't last long. The departing ship was caught up by Monk's doppelganger, and the heat sight ripped the ship in half before falling. After losing the spaceship that served as a signal relay station, the higher mind lost control of Carol. In an instant, the energy in Carol's body disappeared. Carol gasped and said to her father and son, "I'm fine, let go." Clark looked at Monk, who nodded in relief. Carol gasped, and wrapped her hands tightly around her writhing, painful hands, like a helpless woman who had been beaten up. At this moment, Monk's double body flew from a distance, carrying the figure on his back, and when he was about to fall, he accidentally fell down and landed in front of Carol. Boom. The moment the doppelganger disappeared, Monk said to Carol, "They lost their track in the spaceship explosion, and I only found this." Carol looked at the corpse of the brave Rogers with complicated eyes, and sighed silently. 2.4. At this moment, Monk and Clark looked up. Noticing the expressions on the faces of the two, Carol also raised his head abruptly. "I saw a blue light spot pulling behind the rocket, descending rapidly like a meteor. Or is it already here? Is the Supreme Intelligence notifying the accuser fleet again that it is coming back?" Monk frowned, calculating the duration of the ability. It's been long enough. The next moment, Monk soared into the air, facing the missile. Looking at this scene, Carol's hair was disheveled, and a large amount of photon energy was emitted from her body, and her eyes seemed to become two suns. Crackling. After an inconspicuous sound came from her neck, her body slowly flew up, as if breaking free from the shackles of gravity, and turned into a beam of light, grinning towards Monk's back. Advertisement. Chapter 543 Handsome Guy. Advertisement. Carol soared through the air with relief, like a bird freed from its cage. While Monk was fighting against the forces she controlled, she was also fighting against higher intelligence in the invisible psychic realm. Although Monk quickly helped her out of control, in this short time, she also gained a lot. A lot. She realized that if she wanted to, she could break free from the shackles of her superior intelligence and destroy this suppressor of abilities. Her abilities were not given to her by the Kree, but by herself. As long as she wants, no one can restrain her. The thought of this made her very excited. The next moment, as Monk knocked off a falling missile in midair and pushed it away, she did the same, kicking a missile and throwing it high into the air. Boom. The scorching light beam and photon energy pierced the sky, blasting several missiles, and then, a huge explosion exploded in the air like a cloud of fire. Monk and Carol rushed towards the remaining missiles without hesitation. Boom, boom, boom. Like a firecracker exploding, all the Fire 10 rockets were destroyed where the two men flew. Wow. They passed through the cloud of fire and joined the Air Force. "Behind you," Monk said weakly, and flew down. "There is not much time left on the deck, and it is a waste of time to continue fighting. Leave the rest to Carol." At this point, Carol was unstoppable. Carol smiled, looked at the fleet far away from the planet, and launched a charge. Monk landed with just over a minute to go. Clark walked through the cornfield, and the father and son smiled at each other and walked home. "Yo ho ho. Dad, you are amazing. Clark, you're so handsome." Charles and Eric shouted happily and ran to them. Monk hugged them both, and the family looked to Nick Fury and Talos. Both swallowed nervously, especially Nick Fury. Monk punched him hard a few times, but he straightened up so that he would have something to show off. Oh no, something to show off later. After all, it was Monk who punched Carol, not him, which means he was better than Carol. Advertisement. There is nothing wrong with this. Nick Fury nodded expressionlessly. "Are you okay?" Monk sees Nick Fury staring at him blankly. Monk frowned. His body seems to have recovered from the pain. But why does he look a little strange? Is his brain damaged? Nick Fury blinked quickly, regaining consciousness. He gratefully said to Monk, "Thank you just now. If it weren't for you, I would be dead by now." "Really? It's still penetrating," Talos added. The corner of Nick Fury's mouth twitched. Depressed, he stared at Talos. Talos froze for a moment, wondering if what he said was right. Then he added, "It's dead, it's dead." After finishing speaking, he showed a sincere smile to Nick Fury. Nick Fury sighed. Could this alien not read a picture? "Let's go home," Monk said and drove the car home. He was still naked with Clark now. "Then Carol will be all right?" Nick Fury asked worriedly. Monk waved his hand and said, "Don't worry. Hitting those Kree is no worse for her now than it is for you." Nick Fury breathed a sigh of relief. Then he frowned, thinking it made sense but not realizing that something was wrong. Monk and Clark's attempt to change clothes. Carol ending the fight, with good news. Surprise, to be precise. She found Marvel's experimental spaceship, from which she returned in a small spaceship. When the small spaceship landed, Nick Fury, Talos and others broke out into cheery shouts, while Monk let out a low voice. The hatch of the airship opened, and she appeared in front of everyone, holding a blue cube in her hand and rolling up and down, followed by two Skrulls, one big and one small. Talos was silent, then screamed wildly, ran up and hugged the two of them tightly. "This is his wife and children. Thank you, thank you." He warmly thanked Carol. Carol smiled and said, "You care about them, not my core, don't you?" Advertisement. Talos grinned, took the child in his arms, and kissed his wife tenderly. Carol casually tosses the Rubik's Cube into Nick Fury's hands. Nick Fury didn't catch it, but stepped back quickly, hiding behind Clark. There was silence. Carol's mouth twitched and asked, why didn't you catch him? Nick Fury. Who knows if that thing is dangerous, you're just rummaging. Monk looked at the Rubik's Cube lying on the ground, his eyes flickered slightly, and then he let out a chuckle. This thing is a real mess. Pick it up. Carol stepped out of the spaceship and said, this is the power core, but it belongs to S.H.I.E.L.D. After the Rubik's Cube was rescued by Howard Stark many years ago, it remained in S.H.I.E.L.D. until Marvel used it to develop the Lightspeed engine, and then it stayed in Marvel's laboratory for several years. Cuckoo poked his head out from the room, staring at the glowing Rubik's Cube, as if he saw something interesting. When Nick Fury walked up to the Rubik's Cube and put his little paw on it, Cuckoo quickly disappeared. Nick Fury tensed up, squeezed out a smile, and said, he won't scratch my pretty face, will he? Nick Fury 573 waved. Yu Xiaofan looked at Nick Fury, leaned towards him, and wagged his tail. Talos reminded nervously. Kakuzu twitched everyone's mouths as he watched the increasingly blurry face in the dim sky. Nick Fury leaned down, his eyes stayed on Yu Xiaofan for a few seconds, he gently hugged him, seeing that he didn't intend to swallow himself, he was relieved. Nick Fury squatted down, smiled and raised his hand to touch Gugu, but saw Gugu opened his mouth. Cuckoo, get out of the way. Cuckoo stared at Nick Fury menacingly. Carol was speechless for a moment. Nick Fury looked at Talos with mocking eyes and said, it's just a cat, are UFC King afraid of me? Meow. Embarrassed. You'd better stay away from him. Talos explained with a smile. That's the eater of elements, not a cat. Before he finished speaking, Yu Xiaofan opened his mouth suddenly, swallowed the cosmic Rubik's Cube, and tilted his head to look at it. Carol smiled. Look at him, he really likes you. Nick Fury took 2 steps back, sweating, and said to Carol, of course, that thing is dangerous, and everything it touches will be upgraded. Advertisement. Chapter 544 Driver's License. Advertisement. Carol. At this moment, Monk shouted loudly. Carol took a look, and he smiled and pointed to a nearby farm and said, don't forget to throw out the rubbish there. Carol froze for a moment, then smiled and said, I forgot, if you don't tell me, I will deal with it. She went to where the fight was just now. Dad, I'm hungry. Eric whispered to Monk. They were just going to buy groceries, who knew so many things happened behind the scenes. Monk smiled. I'll make you a delicious meal today. After today, the 3 children have gained something new, and their ability level has also improved a lot, so it's time to celebrate. Talos, let's go. Monk greeted. Talos froze for a moment, and said gratefully, thank you. What about me? Nick Fury put his arms around Yu Xiaofan and pointed to his nose. Monk said, if you're doing the dishes later, I might consider doing a copy for you. Nick Fury's face changed, and he said, that's no problem, I'm the best at washing dishes. When Monk heard it, he laughed in the bathroom. If there was a tape recorder at the time, he would have recorded this passage, and he would release it after this guy became the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. It's like a social death scene. A few minutes later, Carol carried Yang Luage's body back to the boat, and she returned to Monk's house, chatting with those who had gathered in anticipation of Monk's dinner. Clark joked, while Eric and Charles played with Talos' daughter, and both exclaimed when they saw Talos' daughter transform into Charles. Watching this scene, Talos and his wife looked at each other and smiled. Their lives seemed to be heading in a good direction. After a while, a scent wafted from the kitchen. Clark, Yinduan. Monk turned to Clark. Clark walked quickly to the kitchen, where plates of colorful dishes were brought out. Upon seeing these dishes, the audience couldn't help but be full of praise, and even gave a thumbs up without hesitation after tasting them. During the delicious food and wine, they chatted carefreely. When Carol heard that the Skrulls were looking for a new home, she remembered Marvel's words and decided to go with the Skrulls to help each other find a new home. Home. Advertisement. Because she felt that the Skrulls needed her more now. After the decision was made, when Nick Fury went to do the dishes, Carol said to Monk, thank you for the time, Monk. Monk smiled and said, when are you coming? Just don't cause trouble. Carol suppressed a laugh and said, I'll just tell Fury and we'll be on our way. Monk nodded. Carol walked into the kitchen. What did the two talk about? Carol came out of the kitchen with Nick Fury. He took the Talos family to say goodbye to Monk and others, and then flew away in an airship. Looking at Monk and others who disappeared from the front, Carol turned to Talos and said, can you go back to the laboratory first? I need to deal with some things. After the memory came back, she remembered her best friend and wanted to meet him before leaving. Talos nodded. No problem. The door of Monk's house. Monk and Nick Fury stood at the door, and Nick Fury looked up at the calm sky with a frustrated expression on his face. A lot happened today. Nick Fury sighed and hugged Yu Xiaofan. Monk nodded. He said, fortunately my family is out of town. Very lucky today, because the place where his family lives is very remote. The fight that happened did not attract anyone's attention. Nick Fury sneered. Affirmative. For saving me tonight. Thanks. Monk snorted in a low voice. Suddenly he said, so many interjections, are the dishes done? Nick Fury's face froze. Then why don't you wash it? I see. After washing, fly away in your broken plane, because it takes up space. Nick Fury replied feebly. Monk snorted softly, turned and walked into the room. Looking at Monk's back, Nick Fury shook his head with a smile. Was Monk really a killer before? Life changed him, didn't it? 3 kids. He looks at 3 children who are playing or listening to music, mate. It's really enviable. Months passed, the three children never stopped growing, and before I knew it, Clark was 16. The age of 16 is one of the most important turning points in a child's life. At least that's what Clark, Charles, and Eric think now. Advertisement. Looking at the driver's license that Clark had just obtained, Charles and Eric were very envious. While Clark's driving will be limited due to his age, it's enough to keep the two excited. Come on, I'll show you around. Clark put away the driver's license and threw in the car keys he had just asked Monk for. Charles and Eric snorted, pushed and walked towards their car alone. When they started the car, under Clark's skillful operation, the car started and disappeared into the distance. Their home is some distance from the town, otherwise he would not dare to drive alone. According to regulations, at his age, if he has just obtained a driver's license, he must be accompanied by an adult, otherwise he will be punished if caught. The car drove onto the road, and Clark drove leisurely, but watching the distant scenery slowly recede, Clark unconsciously accelerated the speed. 60, 70,100,120,150. Clark felt nothing, everything happened much more slowly than he did. Charles, who was sitting in the co-pilot's seat, unconsciously pulled the handle on the side, but there was a joyful expression on his face. Let you run. The three roared in approval. This sentence just doesn't take him seriously. Quote dot. Backquote quick, come in. Come in. Wow. Charles pointed excitedly. But in the next second, he couldn't help laughing, staring stiffly at the smoking car ahead. A police car is parked on the side of the road, checking for speeding behavior. Broken car. The speed of the car was so fast that he didn't even have time to brake before turning, so he overturned at this speed. But what made him desperate was that the speed of the car in front was too fast, and it was too late to brake when turning, the whole car would fly out, and he would be pulled to the ground, which made him doubt his eyesight. Li Lahao, yo ho ho. But Eric's reaction didn't slow down. In the next second, when the car was about to roll out, he squeezed his hand, and the car was pulled by an invisible force, regained its balance and continued to drive forward. Listening to the violent roar of the engine, the three became more and more excited. Clark gradually deviated from the original route and got farther and farther away from the house. They were so excited that they didn't even notice it. The policeman slammed the steering wheel angrily. With a roar, he drove after him. Clark slammed the steering wheel, the wheels scraped rapidly on the ground, the car flipped over and rolled to the side of the road. The roaring police car rushed past with a gust of wind, the policeman inside was stunned for a moment, turned the speedometer, looked at the crazily beating numbers, and said angrily, that's too presumptuous. Advertisement. Chapter 545 Funeral. Advertisement. Monk's car came to a slow stop, emitting black smoke. To go from a Need for Speed car to a vintage farm tractor, all it takes is a 180-degree acceleration and 3 excited kids. The 3 members of the Clark family sat in the car, looking at each other, feeling a little flustered. Why is this car so unresponsive? They were having a good time and the car broke down. What to do? Charles panicked a little. Clark pressed his forehead with a headache. Eric asked nervously, how do you tell Dad? Clark took a deep breath and said, let's say I crashed the car while driving away. But definitely not because the car was going too fast. Charles added, if Dad finds out, Clark will be in trouble. Clark nodded hesitantly, and then both looked at Eric. Eric scratched his hair in frustration, and, okay, that's it. All 3 agreed. Just then, a police car appeared in front of them, and a smiling policeman walked towards them. The 3 patted their foreheads at the same time, and Charles said, leave it to me, or your license will be revoked. Duh. The policeman smashed the glass, looked at Clark's childish face, and muttered, son, show me your driver's license. 250. Clark took out his driver's license and handed it over. The policeman took the driver's license and grinned. It's amazing, my car can't even catch up with you. Clark gave a dry laugh, and Eric grinned and said, thank you. Thank you. The officer squinted at Eric and said, do you think I'm paying you a compliment? With that said, he opened the driver's license and looked at it. Yo ho ho, this is the first day. The policeman looked at Clark with a smile and said, do you know how dangerous it is for you to drive like this now? Sorry. Clark scratched his head and said, I just felt slow at first, too excited to be out there. Then you should calm down, your driver's license is. At this time, Charles stretched out his hand, pressed his index finger and middle finger lightly on his temple, and said, officer, we didn't do anything, did we? The policeman froze for a moment, and replied without hesitation, yes, be careful. He handed Clark his driver's license. Relieved, Clark put the driver's license aside. After the police left, the 3 of them looked at each other in dismay, looking at the smoking front of the car in disappointment. Eric said worriedly, if that car breaks down, Dad will spend a lot of money, right? Advertisement. Hearing this, Locke and Charles looked at each other suspiciously. Their family had a farm and had enough money to live on, but it was not easy for their father to raise the 3 of them. The children of poor families are firstborn children, and although they are not poor, playing with a broken car still makes them very frustrated. Well, Charles. Eric looked at Charles and shook his head. Charles pursed his lips, and Clark said solemnly, don't even think about it. Hearing this, Charles and Eric were relieved and backed away again and again. Don't worry, it's okay. Clark comforted. It won't be a serious problem, right? Why don't you go back first? Dad should be worried after being away for so long. Charles and Eric breathed a sigh of relief, Since Clark said it was all right, then it must be all right. Who are you going? Charles looked at the two of them with some anticipation. Eric and Clark looked at each other, silently stretched out their hands, ready to play a game of rock paper scissors. Ha ha. Eric let out a smug laugh. Clark shrugged indifferently, and said to Eric, "You will be under control soon." He got out of the car, stood behind the car, looked around. Make sure there is nothing. The corners of his mouth slightly raised, and said, "Attention." The next second, Clark pressed the button. The car disappeared in an instant. Ah, two piercing screams seemed to freeze the car in place. When the car came to a stop, Charles and Eric felt their souls were lost. Could it be that the speed was too fast and Eric hadn't figured out the situation yet? This was purely Clark's action. They jumped out of the car pale, clutching the steering wheel, disgusted. Bob Monk just came out at this time, watching this scene, couldn't help laughing. What's wrong? Motion sickness. Motion sickness. Wrong. It's Halo Clark. Both shook their heads, looked at Clark, and couldn't help but vomit again. Clark looks innocent. Monk noticed the smoking front of the car and asked, "Car? Something's wrong." Clark answered bluntly. Monk narrowed his eyes suspiciously, looked around the three of them, noticed Eric's dodging eyes, and asked knowingly, "Are you all right? Are you all right?" Advertisement. All three nodded. Monk muttered, "Next time." All three breathed a sigh of relief. Eric whispered, "I knew I couldn't hide it from my father." Dad. Clark couldn't help but said, "Well, there is also money for car repairs, which will be deducted from my pocket money." Eric and Charles nodded. Monk froze for a moment, then smiled and said, "Isn't it just repairing the car? It doesn't cost much. Our family is not poor enough to ask you for pocket money." After saying these words, he turned around and entered the room, but he felt a murmur in his heart. The child accepted it with understanding, and he was very happy. As for telling them the real situation of the assets at home, Monk decided it was best to wait until they were adults. Looking at Monk's back, the three members of the Clark family were very moved. What a great dad to have. Tick-tock. Outside the window, the heavy rain kept falling, and the whole world was extremely quiet. Monk blushed inexplicably. He stood in front of the closet, took out a black suit and a white shirt, put them on, and stood up straight in front of the mirror. With a well-fitting suit and a slender figure, Monk smiled slightly and noticed that there were more and more gray hairs on his temples. Still so handsome, but unconsciously turned into a middle-aged man. He tried the manifestation elixir, cultivation cheats and the like, but he couldn't reveal it at all. He is very capable, but he is not a god, and he can manifest whatever he wants. After all, this ability still has many limitations, and to some extent, it is not foolproof. Only, Monk counted with his fingers. He could live to see Clark and they get married and have children, which is much better than that guy named Howard. Howard's funeral is today. The guy left after just over a year in the world, still humble and content. Before he died, Howard called him, thanked Monk again, and left a gift for Monk. Thanks. Gift. Monk doesn't think Howard owes him anything. Monk is grateful for Howard's cover for him as a friend over the years, cleaning up the messages he accidentally left with the three kids. Companion. Monk turned and left the room. He is going to see his friend for the last time. Advertisement. Chapter 546. The same idea. Advertisement. The raindrops gradually became thinner and thinner, and when blown by the wind, they fluttered back and forth like cow hair, and fell on people, bringing bursts of chills. Howard's farewell ceremony was over, and the old man was buried in the cemetery. Monk watched from a distance, until the people were almost gone. He picked up the umbrella and walked slowly to the old man's tombstone. Apparently, more than one person had the same idea as him. Monk nodded to Peggy Carter. The two stood in front of the tombstone, and Tony stood a little further away silently watching Maria being sent back by Tony because of her heartbreak. Peggy Carter looked at Howard's tombstone. This weather-beaten Eagle Country rose could no longer hold back tears and her eyes were still red after all. This is her last old friend. This is her comrade in arms, her best friend who fought side by side against Hydra, founded S.H.I.E.L.D. and fought together for decades. She gently wiped away her tears and smiled at Monk and said, "To this day I still think it was a joke made by another person who jumped out of the ground and laughed at me for crying so sad." Monk thought for a while. With Howard's temper, such a thing could indeed be done. The corner of Peggy Carter's mouth twitched, and she looked at Monk. "Actually, Howard and I are very envious of your life. You are too tired to live." Peggy Carter nodded, sighed, "Maybe, but it's our choice, and we always feel like we can do something for the world." Monk looked at each other and said, "I'm very touched. Perhaps most superheroes have this mentality, which is a sense of responsibility that all human beings have, but many people do not realize or give up this sense of responsibility, and this sense of responsibility has been strengthened in superheroes." "I'm retiring." Peggy Carter flatly Kaido. Monk nodded. "But I'm going to keep an eye on Tony and Maria until I'm sure their lives won't be disturbed, and then I'll retire from S.H.I.E.L.D. Having said that, Monk raised his eyebrows and said, "They can come to me if they have any questions." In short, he and the old man became friends. Peggy Carter said with a smile, "You put him at ease when you say that." "That's right," Peggy Carter asked, turning the subject in another direction. "What do you think of Nick Fury?" Monk froze for a moment, blushing strangely. "Don't ask me such questions, I'm not familiar with him." "I see. Quote. Understand what?" The corner of Monk's mouth twitched, but he still didn't forget the purpose of coming today. Putting a daisy in the pile of flowers in front of the tombstone, Monk stood up and said to Peggy Carter, "Goodbye." Advertisement. Peggy Carter nodded, still standing quietly in front of the tombstone. She wants to spend more time with old friends. Monk walked over to his car. But he was stopped by Tony in front of the car. Monk looked at the tired Tony in disbelief and asked, "What happened?" Tony looked at Monk, his mouth gaping open. The title is the same as Uncle, but he couldn't say a word. He took out a bag with a piece of paper in it and said, "The old man left you a piece of paper. The old man left you a long-awaited gift." Monk looked at him lightly and said, "I agree with your idea. I agree with your idea but disagree with your behavior too." He guessed what was inside. Tony handed him the package again and said, "This is his entrustment before he died. If he can't do it well, he will come back to me." 11. Out of the corner of Monk's eye he caught a glimpse of this. This way of persuading people. He is really unique. He glanced at his phone. He picked up the phone, nodded to Tony and said, "Take care of Maria." "I see." Tony nodded. Monk opened the car door, got in, rolled down the window. He called out to Tony, and when he turned his head to look, he said, "Howard told me that you were his pride and joy." Tony felt that his heart was going to be pulled. He took a deep breath and said with a slightly trembling voice, "Thank you." Monk closed the window, looked at Tony who was leaving quickly, and sighed softly, "An era is coming to an end. The next era will be the era of superheroes." Superhero. Thinking of his family of 3, Monk's eyes were full of anticipation. "I really don't know what role these 3 children will play in the future." Snort. Thinking of what was waiting for him, Monk couldn't help grinning. Maybe it will be fun. He looked at the debris bag in his hand, took a deep breath, and opened the package. As he expected, there was a check and a letter for a large amount of money inside. Monk pocketed the check for change, shook his head with a smile, and opened the letter Howard had given him. Glancing at it, Monk couldn't help but smile, and put the letter back in the envelope. 0 looking for flowers. Oh well, he's already a rich man, although he's not trying to make money. Advertisement. Time always slips away unconsciously, leaving only memories and unique taste sensations. Monk. Hard to say. Bubbles formed when the meat came into contact with the oil. Monk was stirring the meat, then turned to Clark who was helping to wash the dishes and said, "Clark, is there anything you want to say to me?" Clark, who had turned 18, answered without hesitation, "No." Monk raised his eyebrows and said, "Really?" Clark silently put the plate aside, picked up a freshly washed apple and stuffed it into his mouth, then walked out the door with the apple plate, and said uncertainly, "I don't know what you want to say. I don't know what you want. What are you talking about, Daddy?" Monk grinned and said, "I remember you were supposed to have a graduation. Have you found a date yet?" Unable to communicate. There was no answer for a long time. Monk turned his head and saw that Clark had disappeared into the kitchen. Child. Monk was overwhelmed and laughed. Clark is already 18 years old, and he is still an innocent boy. Yes, the kind of guy who's never been in a relationship. In such a country, such a situation is simply unthinkable. As for Hope, although Clark and she have remained close, they have not become boyfriend and girlfriend, but best friends. Maybe it was because Clark was too reserved in school, maybe because of Clark's appearance, how could he lose contact? I didn't see that B************. D. Charles changed several times a year, and even Eric said he changed twice. Etc. Monk suddenly remembered something very important. Clark can't take care of this, can he? Monk dumped the food onto his plate, clenched his jaw, and decided to talk to Clark. The 4 father and son walked into the restaurant with fried food, and while eating dinner, they chatted about interesting things. Mengshu brought the topic to Clark's dance. Clark frowned and said, "I'm not going to any dances." "That can't be done." Before Monk could speak, Charles called out, "You have to go to the school prom, it's very important." Eric nodded and said, "This is the last time you have fun as a child before you become an adult. It is the end and beginning of the next phase of your life. You have to go." B. Advertisement. Chapter 540th 7th Dance. Advertisement. Seeing his father and 2 older brothers urging himself, Clark was silent for a moment and said, "I will think about it." Having said this, he quickly finished his supper and went upstairs. Seeing this scene, the father and son sighed. Monk gave Charles a piece of meat and said, "Eat it, I'll tell him later. If he really doesn't want to go, you can't kill him either." Charles muttered, "I thought the 3 of us would have a chance to join forces this time. You guys." Monk raised his eyebrows and said, "Isn't it a prom?" "But we also invited other people." Charles blinked and said, "There are a few classmates who are about to graduate, and they invited Eric and me." Eric nodded, a little excited. "I heard it's quite interesting." Monk stared at the 2. Old cows eat young grass. Ahem. Charles said with a blushing face, "Dad, what are you talking about? Nothing will happen on October 20th. Let's just eat and dance." Eric nodded and said, "If I didn't want to see the prom, I wouldn't accept that high school girl's invitation." Monk looked at the 2 suspiciously, half closed his eyes and said, "Don't worry, I'm fine. Don't worry, I don't want to be a grandpa in a year." "Dad," Charles said, looking at Monk with wide eyes. "What are you thinking? It's time to clear your mind." "Dad." Monk tapped Charles on the head with his chopsticks and said, "B*******************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************�e. And took a bite of his meal. "Dad, we're going to the prom and we need clothes." Eric added. "Be formal." No problem, when is the dance? The day after tomorrow. Monk thought for a while and said, then let's go shopping in town together tomorrow. Daddy, I love you. Charles smiled happily and winked at Monk. Monk wrinkled his nose and said, don't blame me, I'm not that kind of little girl. Ha ha ha. Eric tapped his finger on the table with a smile. Dad, how did you know Charles used it against those guys? Monk shrugged and said, don't forget, I raised you, and I knew what you were going to fart before you even opened your mouth. Ha ha. Advertisement. Both laughed, then froze. This is not true, is it? Cough. Hurry up and eat. Monk knocked on the table and said, clean up the dishes later. Both nodded. A few minutes later, Monk finished his meal and went upstairs, standing at the door of Clark's house. When he raised his finger to knock on the door, finger trembled, thinking about what he was about to say, before knocking on the door again. Clark opened the door and gasped, Daddy you. Monk walked in with a smile, looked at the books thrown on the bed, and sighed. You are already this old. Have you decided which university to go to? Clark has good grades. There are many choices. He has already got admission letters from many schools. I chose a place close to home. Harvard. Clark nodded. He said, it's nice there. Meng smiled and looked at the young man standing in front of him. He was very satisfied. Tall figure, handsome features. Blue eyes, smooth black hair. What's wrong with being handsome? Besides, he has good academic performance, is polite and gentle. Well, I am such a good father who educates children. Dad, what's the matter? Carrick waved at Monk. Monk turned around. I'm going to buy prom dresses with Charles tomorrow, why don't you go with us? Clark hesitated and said, Dad, I've thought about it, but I still don't want to go. Yes, but think about it, there is only one dance, and if you miss it, there will be no second time. Ah, didn't you say you wanted to experience the life of an ordinary high school student? Clark hesitated for a moment, remembering that he had never been to high school and had little contact with his classmates, so he bit the bullet and said to Monk, Dad, it's hard to find a dance partner now, and most of them already made an appointment half a month ago. Monk patted Clark on the shoulder and said, don't worry, there may be a girl in the same situation as you that day, and you will be a good match. As soon as the words fell, Monk saw that Clark was still hesitant, coughed lightly, moved to Clark, and whispered, are you afraid of the murder scene? Clark's eyeballs popped out all of a sudden, the corners of his mouth twitched upwards, and he said angrily, Dad. Ha ha ha. Mark smiled dryly and said to Clark, don't worry, there will be a way. Clark blushed and said angrily, I'll fix it. Advertisement. Stunned, Monk patted Clark on the shoulder and said, good job. Clark, then let's go together tomorrow. After saying these words, without waiting for Clark to object, Monk left the room, closed the door behind him, and then shook his finger, not noticing that the room across the corridor was ajar. Charles and Eric smiled sarcastically, opened the door and walked out. Daddy, how are you doing? It's a deal, let's go together tomorrow. Good. Both nodded in agreement. Eric said, when it comes to prom, the three of us will fill the dance floor. Charles falters, but on King's Land, I'm not going to let that happen. Due to the difference in individual development characteristics, although they are obviously twins, there is still a gap in height. After looking at Charles from head to toe, he said disdainfully, short. Shorty. After checking the side again, nothing new appeared, and Monk was relieved. Monk went downstairs to make himself a cup of coffee, and went back to his room to sit at his desk. Every year at the ball, they will elect the ball king and queen. A year ago, the two brothers who lived in the same room for 12.34 years finally slept separately under the urging of the two. He has a great support team. 1 second were dancing together on the dance floor, the next were going to war. On the map, on top of the endless frost, stood a man with an expressionless face. Snort. Eric narrowed his eyes and spread his hands. Huh, just you. Both of them snorted in a low voice and turned back. 2 hours later, Japan's new map appeared. After the system almost cheated him, Monk has been checking carefully for a while, in case something new happens and he doesn't notice it. Charles gritted his teeth and said, then we'll see on the day of graduation. Monk stared at the backs of the two, at a loss. A blank map instantly appeared in his mind, and then he pinched the map and began to materialize it. Monk put the cards aside, carefully observing a system he hadn't looked at in a long time. Advertisement. Chapter 548. Model. Advertisement. Moderator. Monk Kent. Novice gift. Assassin time. Abilities. Memory Fantasy Avatar. Memory Fantasy Avatar. Current ability level. LV3. Current modernization progress. 90. Son. Clark Kent Kryptonian. Son. Eric Kent Mutant, awakened. Son. Charles Kent Mutant, awakened. This is the current state of Monk capabilities. Not far from LV4. He is looking forward to what changes will happen after he reaches LV4. Moreover, judging from the rewards he received when he upgraded his ability before, if he guessed correctly, he would be able to obtain the character's permanent ability. That's what made him look forward to it. After logging out and logging in, Monk stretched himself, finished his cold coffee, and went to the bathroom. After taking a shower, Monk picked up the phone that had been thrown aside and grinned at the new text message on it. A message from Raven. Since the Hellfire breakup, She's been living alone, and only occasionally texts or calls Monk to ask what's going on, and if she happens to be around NYC, they do it together and have a good chat in bed. It's just that there are not many such opportunities. After 10 returned a message to Levine, Monk threw the phone on the pillow and went to bed. The next day, Monk woke up the 3 members of Clark's family early in the morning. After eating something, the family of 3 set off for New York. Along the way, Eric and Charles seemed very excited, while Clark was a little confused. Monk looked at Clark sitting in the passenger seat, and comforted him with a puzzled expression. Don't worry, there will definitely be a dance partner asking you out tomorrow. Clark nodded sullenly, looked out the window, and asked a little puzzled, aren't we going to buy clothes? Monk smiled. You graduated from high school, you have a graduation present. Gift. Charles and Eric snuggled together. What is it? You will know by now. Monk smiled mysteriously. A few minutes later, Monk pulled up in front of a car dealership. Clark was stunned, and looked at Monk in surprise. Dad. This isn't the gift you were talking about, is it? Advertisement. Car dealership. Monk teased, you think too much, your gift is inside. Wow, no way, Dad, you're so prejudiced. Eric and Charles gasped and looked at Clark enviously. It's certainly cool to have your own car at school. Monk looked at the two of them. When you graduate, I'll buy one for each of you. Charles's eyes lit up and said, then I can finish my studies now. He had already mastered all the subjects at school alone. Oh, you're such a clever little ghost. Monk laughed, and Charles got carried away and interrupted him, saying, then you have to get your driver's license first. Charles slapped his head, bewildered. He's only 15 years old, and he can't get his driver's license yet, maybe next year. Eric also sighed helplessly. Put this crap down and get out. Clark's depressed mood disappeared all of a sudden, and he dragged Monk to the garage with a whoosh. Because Monk booked the car in advance and had seen several models in advance, Clark chose the model and color, Monk paid the money, and the car was driven away by Yaren. Charles walked around the car, patted the car, and smiled at Clark. How is it? I said yellow looks good. Eric nodded. He said, I agree. The car looks very young. Because of the yellow color. It looks very lively. Turning head to Clark, he said, try it. Monk tossed the key to Clark. Clark took the keys and walked quickly to the car. Eric pulled Charles out, who had already moved to the passenger seat, and the man in Charles's incompetent anger immediately sat down in the passenger seat. Do you want to get in the car? Eric gritted his teeth and asked Charles with a smile. Charles raised his middle finger. Monk frowned. Charles. Charles smiled sarcastically. He opened the car door and sat in the back seat. Let's go. Boarding. Clark reminded, and opened the car door amidst the shouts of the two. Slower. Monk looked at the car disappearing from sight, shook his head with a smile, and shouted. After waiting for a while, Clark turned the car around, and seeing the satisfied expressions of the three, Monk realized that he bought the right car. Advertisement. Next stop, shopping for clothes. Monk looked at the car coming from behind from the rearview mirror, saw the 3 people happily joking about something, then looked at his empty car, and couldn't help saying with emotion, everyone has no conscience, and it's okay to have a new love. Forget old love. Laughing out loud, the old father sighed and shook his head helplessly. When they came to the specialty store, the 3 brothers each bought a suit. Standing together was very spectacular. On the initiative of the 3, Monk also bought a suit. When the 4 of them stood together, the shopping guide's eyes sparkled, and he couldn't help saying, you're so handsome. Have vision. Charles laughed, but Monk rubbed his head. Let's go on horseback. After Monk finished speaking, the 4 of them changed their clothes, and then walked out of the specialty store with the clothes. When he arrived in New York, Monk decided to look around and stop by Chinatown to buy spices. By the time he finished his work and returned home, it was already evening. The 3 boys finished their dinner and went upstairs to sleep with various emotions, while Monk watched Clark's back with a mysterious smile. He will make this kid the brightest student of tomorrow. The crow's ability is very practical, but not very powerful, and it can last for quite a long time after it is manifested, enough for a few dances. I don't know what to do when I leave. Slow down. The next day, they have partners. He didn't. No hurries. Monk yelled, watched the taillights turn into 2 dots of light, turned and closed the car door until they were no longer visible, and flipped through a deck of playing cards in his hand. Eric and Charles took Clark out of the house and drove Clark's car to the ball. Make no mistake, this is the crow's ability. The admission time for the ball is 6:30 in the evening, and at 4 o'clock, Charles and Eric have started to dress. Note. Guess who I am? But he procrastinated again and again, and he finished it at 5:30. Charles ran into Clark's room, saw that Clark was still changing clothes idly, and said, hurry up, we have to get up early. The two combed their hair, wore suits, and corsages. Although they were only 15 years old, they looked like children of 17 or 18. Clark fastened the buttons leisurely, glanced at his watch, and said intently, it's only 5 o'clock. It's only 5 o'clock now, don't worry, we won't be late. Clark. Name. Demon Head. Monk looked at the cards in his hand and murmured, I'll be impressed, she looks like a model of her father. Character introduction. A woman with many changes, no one knows her true identity. Advertisement. 540th Ix Louise. Advertisement. Night fell. The Onyx bar in town is a little different than usual. Unlike the usual noisy environment, if you ignore the occasional sound of swallowing saliva, it is very quiet inside. At this moment, all the men in the bar are staring at the beautiful figure standing in front of the bar, while the women can't help but secretly envy and hate. Her perfect body curves, red-brown long hair hanging down the back, just seeing this scene, people can't help but want to hug each other. At this time, she turned around holding the wine glass, and a delicate face appeared in front of everyone. The charming temperament and cold expression are like ice and fire torturing the hearts of these people. Finally, someone couldn't bear it anymore, picked up the wine glass and walked over. Miss, if you want to drink something, just order it. A blonde, blue-eyed, handsome man waved his hand and showed a seemingly charming smile. If this woman is really a woman, instead of Monk becoming a mantra, maybe he would not refuse to chat with the other party, but Monk turned away, frowned and said, "Get out." The sound is crisp and sweet, like the crisp bells in the ice and snow. The man froze for a moment, but instead of being angry, he praised, "The voice is really nice." Monk, is this the lethality of beauty? After using the deck, he decided to stop by the tavern for a drink and see if anything interesting happened in a fit of bad humor. It turned out to be quite interesting, but I didn't know what to say after looking at these people for a while. Don't want to poke their eyes. Monk growled inwardly. After drinking the wine in his glass, Monk was about to leave when a man stood in front of Monk, holding a wine glass in his hand, and said foolishly, "Belle, as long as you want, I can do anything for you." Monk squinted at his interlocutor and confirmed, "Anything." That's right. Seeing that the beauty in front of him was interested, the man replied excitedly. Monk muttered earnestly, "Okay, let's go get a PhD or something first." After saying this, he walked out of the tavern quickly. The man looked at Monk's back and shouted, "I'll go. I'll come." Monk's mouth twitched wildly. It's got it all, really. Out of the tavern, Monk corrected his image. Going to the prom with such an image. It is definitely neat and uniform, and it is definitely the focus of everyone's attention, but it is too mature, right? It needs to be more pure. Monk pondered in his mind. After adjusting the image, a card appeared in his hand, and disappeared near Clark's school at the same instant. There was a dance after the sit-in, and Monk stayed in the tavern for a while. He didn't find time to come here until the dance was almost over. Although the gym where the prom is held will be closed after the prom starts. Is this a problem for Monk? Advertisement. After using his tricks to sneak onto the prom stage, Monk reveals himself in the corner. As he approaches the crowd, he starts looking for Clark. Is it the same? Rick didn't notice where he passed. A pair of eyeballs seemed to be glued to him. And if these kids don't have a partner, surely they came to him for the dance first. Ha, killing me. Monk snorted. With his help today, Clark is definitely the brightest student, and he won't regret his high school career. Huh. At this moment, Monk raised his legs and narrowed his eyes. It's Eric. At this moment, Eric was dancing with his arms around the girl, talking in a low voice, but the distance between the two was getting closer. The corner of Monk's mouth twitched, and he turned his face away without opening his eyes. It's Charles. At this time, a boy was surrounded by several girls and stood in the center, talking and laughing happily with a smile on his face, looking like he was doing well. The corners of Monk's mouth twitched wildly. Good, good, good. It seems that he no longer has to worry about finding a partner for these two children. Turning his head, Monk finally saw Clark. At this time, Clark in a strict suit was sitting in the corner, wearing headphones and watching the couple on the dance floor, without any expression on his face. He didn't seem to belong to the occasion and looked very lonely. What the hell happened? Not too bad in Clark's case, is it? Monk muttered under his breath and was about to walk towards him when it happened. A man walks up, leaving his partner behind. Hello, my name is. Snapped. Monk slapped the other person's face, and the man threw the slap aside and continued walking towards Clark. Hey hey. The boy turned around and walked towards Monk step by step, with a sneer on his face. You won't do that freak dance first, will you? Freak. Monk raised an eyebrow. Yeah, don't you know? The boy looked in disbelief at the beautiful girl standing in front of him. Advertisement. Monk shook his head with interest and said, Can you tell me about it? Ha, of course, said the boy with a smile. It is said that he is a weirdo. Then, the boys talked about how Clark beat other classmates in school, even knocked down a dozen classmates by himself, and he usually did not exercise with other classmates. Maybe it's because you're afraid that if you accidentally mismanage it, you'll hurt others. Monk is a little annoyed. What about beating others? When he asked, the man grinned and said, someone probably said something about his father. Ha, of course, only a nerdy father can raise such a bookish son. Yeah, Monk grinned, and a card appeared in his hand, then disappeared. Skill. Fear. The next second, the boy yelled in horror, as if seeing something terrible. He took a step back and ran out the door with a yell of horror. Monk walked up to Clark and stood in front of him. As Clark looked at him, Monk smiled inwardly and said, Can I ask you to dance? Clark froze. He didn't expect anyone to actually ask him to dance. He hurriedly took off the earphones, and spread his arms to both sides calmly, a little at a loss. Obviously, he didn't know what to make of the invitation. Monk watched this scene and sighed silently. The kid never talks about what happened at school, if he doesn't come this time. She grabs Clark's hand and pulls him onto the dance floor like a child, moving slowly to soothing music. I recommend. Good money, this is the last dance. For a moment, the two became the focus of the audience, while Eric and Charles stood behind, their eyes widened in surprise, but they were still sincerely happy for Clark. At the end of the song, they sat in the corner again. So, what's your name? Clark asked a little nervously. Facing Clark's frown, Monk thought hard. This silly boy, wouldn't it be love at first sight? Louise. Monk babbled and said yes. I'm Clark. Clark introduced himself seriously, but he didn't expect that the person standing in front of him turned out to be his father. Monk nodded and looked towards the center of the dance floor. The ball is over, the king and queen have been chosen, but what happens next exceeds all expectations. When the prom king and queen stood on the podium in front of the dance floor, under the illumination of the focusing lights, and accepted everyone's gaze and applause with a smile on their faces, a pot of red liquid was poured on their heads. Advertisement. Chapter 550. Which carry? Advertisement. Is that blood? Monk frowned at the smell of blood in the air. However, it should not be human blood. Are these kids really playing this crazy lately? Monk looked surprised. Clark thought he was startled, and hurried towards him. Monk. Child, will you move out of the way? I think there's something wrong with your dad. The corner of Monk's mouth twitched. He silently remembered this in his heart, moved his footsteps, glanced at the bonus table again, and frowned. The girl was Carrie, 1 year younger than Clark. Clark was in school because he didn't want to make friends and no one dared to mess with him, but this girl was excluded and bullied because she messed with bad guys. This time, it was clear that someone was messing with her. Carly was covered in blood and stood there motionless, as if frozen. She moved her arms stiffly, like a bloody puppet moving grotesquely. Applause, surprise, screams. The whole ballroom became extremely bloody in an instant, like a vivid picture scroll. The girl spun around in place, a pair of big hazy eyes fixed on the expressions of everyone present, and the instigator was still smiling quickly on her head. At this moment, the woman who was greatly shocked seemed to have a devilish whisper in her heart. She has always had a secret, that is, she does not know why, at what time, she has a superpower, but because of fear, she has never shown it to others. In her head, a voice told her to let go, not to hold back. She raised her hand, her eyes slowly revealing a tyrannical expression. Yes, don't be depressed. Since she was a child, she has been suppressing herself constantly, and the only person who makes her feel depressed is her mother. Her mother is a fanatical believer. After giving birth to Carrie and being insulted, she believes that Carrie is God's punishment for her. She locks her up, prays to her, and even thinks that menstruation is God's punishment for her daughter's shameful thoughts and actions. Punish. The pressure from her family and the bullying by her classmates made Carrie pay a heavy price. Not only did she become emotionally unstable, but she even had some violent incidents from time to time. Advertisement. Now, the voice in her head is getting louder. She remembered. Has this voice always been there? Ever since she awakened her abilities for some reason, has this voice always been in her heart? As she encounters more and more things, her abilities are getting stronger and stronger. Bath. Does it appear more and more frequently? Is the sound getting louder? Even now, she seems to feel a silent whisper accompanying her heart. The hot breath like magma is ringing in her ears. What just now? A tall figure appeared in front of her, throwing clothes on her. She froze, her head cleared. It was Clark. Did she know him? At the back of the school again, she cautiously peeked at Clark, unexpectedly. At that moment, it was Clark who helped her. Clark whispered, "Let's go." Carly froze in place, the persuasive voice in her mind trembling slightly. There was silence in the hall, and then the noise grew louder. Voices of contempt, mocking voices, voices whispering about freaks, all of which she heard behind her back. Clark didn't care about this, he turned his head and looked in Louise's direction. In the haze. Where are people? How did Clark turn around again? Carly's body trembled slightly again. Unexpectedly, after a slight shaking, the persuasive voice in her mind became more and more clear. Not only does it fill her with longing, but it also lets her cranky out. And the object of this desire happens to be Clark. Don't you wish you had a man like this? Don't you wish you had such a man who would give you warmth and help you when you were in trouble? The small bookshelves used by book lovers have been hung up, but now almost everyone uses app. Come on, take it, give me its soul, and I will be with you forever. Warmth. Carrie clutched her clothes tightly, her eyes went blank, and her last psychological defense was shattered. She reached out and grabbed Clark's hand, greedy in her eyes. Clark's heart sank, he turned his head to look at Carly, and suddenly felt an invisible force rushing towards him. Clark frowned and took a step back. Carrie, covered in blood, tilted her head and whispered, "Come with me." Advertisement. As soon as the words fell, an invisible force pressed against Clark's whole body. With a slight jolt, Clark freed himself from the restraints. Carrie looked up at Clark suddenly, regaining more strength. But Clark continued to surge forward with ease, making his way to the podium. There is something wrong with this girl. Clark muttered in his heart, looked at the classmates and teachers who stayed on their seats and watched the farce without recognition, and shouted, "Go." As soon as the words fell, Clark rushed to Charles and Eric. "Don't move," she screamed in pain, feeling that her head might burst in the collision of two forces at any moment. Charles pressed his forehead, and his thoughts swept across the room, sending invisible thoughts into the room, causing the surviving teachers and classmates to fall into a deep sleep. Eric waved his arms, creating a series of metal missiles to protect Charles and himself. As for Clark, he doesn't need their protection. With Carrie's roar, Her eyes instantly turned orange, and a more terrifying force burst out from her body, and even began to replace Charles's thoughts bit by bit. Charles. Eric. Accompanied by screams, an invisible force rushed towards Carrie's surroundings like an invisible wave, blowing away everything along the way. People finally realized something was wrong and started panicking. Seeing Clark's back and those faces full of hatred, Carrie exploded. Carly roared, an invisible force tore from her body, the entire podium began to vibrate, followed by the entire floor of the gymnasium, and then the lights of the entire stadium began to flicker, and the bulbs began to flicker. Seeing this scene, Clark swallowed lightly, and his body, no longer disguised, exploded and appeared in front of Charles, using his back to help Charles block the flying human creatures. At the same time, Eric waved his arms angrily, and the metal gathered in front of him, like a metal wall, blocking the flying creatures for him. Charles frowned. Her strength is growing rapidly, and there is another voice in her head, Dianguang is about to explode. If it weren't for her ability to control things with the power of mind, and her extremely powerful mental power, she might have been controlled by Charles long ago. Ah! Quote exclamation mark quote. Under the power of Charles's thoughts, Carrie could only rely on her own experience to fight. Clark whimpered, not needing to communicate that the three brothers' years of mutual understanding made them react. Why? Why are you all hurting me? Why? Advertisement. Chapter 551 I am different from you. Advertisement. Another voice. Charles always felt that the owner of this voice gave him a familiar feeling, but he couldn't remember where it came from. Carrie's strength is not weak anymore, the owner of the voice is still sending her energy continuously, making her stronger and stronger, and the aura on her body is getting more and more evil. Click. In the collision of invisible forces, Carrie heard the sound of objects breaking. Hurry up, let's get out of here. Charles tried his best to hold Carrie back and said to Eric. Eric turned his back to Charles, and Clark appeared in front of Carrie in a flash, grabbing his opponent with one hand. Snort. Carly's orange eyes looked back and forth at Clark and Eric standing beside her for a long time, an invisible force condensed in front of her, protecting her and wrapping around Clark like a rope. Clark reached out and grabbed the girl in front of him expressionlessly. Seeing Carrie's bewildered expression, he thought those halo ropes were nothing, grabbed her by the neck, and jumped to his feet. Ah! Clark punched through the roof, landed on it, and ran away. Ah! Carrie roared, her thoughts destroying everything around her. The roof shattered, the wind howled, and debris from the ring shot at Clark like bullets. Bang! 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 Clark didn't move. To him, this was just scratching the surface. Only a second later, or even less time, Clark rushed out of the school with Carrie, and quickly ran to the outskirts of the town. Shocked by Clark's strength, Carrie asked loudly, why? 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 You have such great power, why don't you take revenge on them? Why? As soon as the words fell, Clark had already led her to the outskirts of the town. Clark put his arms around Carrie's neck, froze for a moment, and replied calmly, because I'm different from you. Carrie was stunned for a moment, and a slight smile escaped from the corner of her mouth. Then let's die together. Soul, that voice wanted more soul, and Clark's soul was something that voice craved so much. Click. There was another crisp sound, and scarlet blood suddenly flowed from Carrie's head. Then, under Clark's gaze, a pair of horns only a few centimeters long grew on Carrie's head. Is that the devil? Everything was churning in Clark's mind. Advertisement. What exactly is going on? Boom. The doubts in Clark's heart had just emerged, and even more terrifying thoughts burst out from Carrie, throwing Clark back again and again. Clark frowned and rushed to Carrie again. But this Carrie stood motionless on the spot, not intending to dodge or block at all. Boom. The fist stopped in front of Carrie. The blown blows messed up Carrie's bloody hair. Carrie looked at Clark with a smile. She even pulled the suit on her body and said, you won't kill people, right? You're such a kind person. After saying this, she reached out and grabbed Clark's hand. Pulling Clark's hand around her neck, she said, squeeze. Then you'll see the blood and you'll see my rolling head. Then, they will become one and enter hell together. Clark looked at each other with sky blue eyes and asked, are you still human? Who knows? While speaking, a long tail grew from her back, swishing. Does not look like. Clark shook his head and said, so what? You don't die so easily. He noticed a small gash on Carrie's body, which glistened. When the devil's horns appeared, it seemed that the girl who had been bullied had changed in a way he didn't understand. So, he grabbed Carrie's neck, and under his gaze, he pulled her forward forcefully and pushed her to the ground. Boom. A large hole appeared in the ground. The corners of Clark's mouth raised slightly, and he muttered to himself, of course, you don't die so easily. He crushed Carrie. He buried her face in the ground, trying to suffocate him. The method is a little clumsy, but very useful. Ah. Then yell. Clark frowned, exerting a little more strength. The screams subsided, but the ground trembled for a moment, and then the ground under their feet collapsed, and even rolled over, tripping them both, and Carrie took the opportunity to break free from his speed. Clark stomped on the ground desperately, but the ground under his feet was like sand, and he couldn't exert any force at all. 0 for flowers 0. Advertisement. Dot. The next second, more and more soil hit Clark's side. Carrie, who broke free from the shackles, looked at Clark who was wrapped in the soil ball, and hummed softly. Her body slowly flew upwards, and with a wave of her arm, the soil ball also flew upwards. Clark wasn't dead, she could feel it. She increased her strength, and the soil ball became harder and smaller. But, An irresistible force pierced the mud ball, and Clark fell from a height. He half closed his eyes at Carrie, shrugged, and finally got serious. Subdue the opponent as soon as possible, and then see if the father can save the girl. As for cannibalism, if he could strike without hesitation, he wouldn't be Clark. 0. WWW. After all, he is still kind by nature, he is still just a boy who has just turned 18, and he is not yet a man. At this time, two figures appeared in the sky. They are Eric and Charles. They sat on metal chairs surrounded by a mass of metal. Clark's mouth twitched. At this time, Charles's voice sounded in Clark's mind. Get rid of her quickly. She is no longer a human being. There is an inexplicable power protecting her head. With the power I use now, it will take a while to invade her head. Maybe if you fight, I can take advantage of her, find opportunities when distracted. Clark nodded, then yelled, Ek. Eric's eyes flashed, and he landed behind Clark. At the same time, with a wave of his palm, a large amount of metal flew towards Carrie in the air. Seeing this, Carrie also stretched out her hand, blocking the metal with her thoughts. At this moment, Clark's body flashed, disappeared on the spot, and when he reappeared, he was already above Carrie's head. Carly startled and tried to dodge as Eric's metal surrounded them. The next instant, Clark grabbed Carrie and pinned her to the ground through the air. Boom. The ground shook, and Carrie fell into the soil, spitting out a mouthful of blood, and recovered quickly. It's done. At this moment, Charles gave a cry of joy, and Carrie lay motionless on the ground. Clark let go of his hand, and Eric froze for a moment. Advertisement. Chapter 552, True Power. Advertisement. Just then, something happened. Laughing out loud. Laughing loudly, Carrie, covered in blood, flew up, looking at the three of them with demonic eyes. A more ferocious halo erupted from her body, and everything around her was shaking and swimming. It's over. What's over? Carly looked at the three playfully, with awe in her eyes. He saw the three of them again, and his soul was more perfect. Charles. Clark and Eric glanced at Charles. Charles's eyes sparkled when he spoke. There is another soul in her body, and he is manipulating her body. If it weren't for the power of the soul, he wouldn't have to spend so much effort to conquer Carrie. Meet again. Carrie, oh no, it's Mephisto now, and greeted the three of them with a smile. The three of Clark were a little puzzled, and couldn't remember who this was, the 5-second generation. At this time, Monk quietly appeared in front of the three of them. He was nearby, watching the fight between the three, but he didn't come out. Seeing the appearance of Monk, Clark and Charles went away. Thanks to their abilities, they had already spotted the monk who had just followed behind the two of Charles. Quote. A question mark appeared on Eric's face. When did his father come? Mephisto looked at Monk and said with a smile. You can't stop me, besides, the old god will not come to rescue you this time. Last time he used magic power to make Yi aware of his existence, but this time he just used the power of the contract to enhance the power Carrie already possessed, making her change. Of course, according to his character as detailed as Ultimate, what appears at this moment is still a split soul. But if only the soul. Monk smiled weakly. Do you think it was still 12 years ago? Mephisto was puzzled. As soon as he finished speaking, Monk turned his head. Charles, kill him, let him see your history. Yes, from the beginning of the fight with Carrie, the three brothers did not use their full strength and did not show their true strength. Advertisement. Because they are afraid that if they are not careful, some classmates will be injured and bring trouble to Monk, so they have been controlling their own power. Real power. Mephisto's eyes narrowed. Charles grinned. According to my father, he is not afraid of getting into trouble. In the next moment, a terrifying thought force rushed towards Carly like a frenzy. It was like a hurricane raging the soul of Mephisto's doppelganger. Does Mephisto want to resist? But the wall cast by the power of the mind is instantly shattered by the power of Charles's mind, and then his separated soul is also torn into pieces. Ah! The painful screams from the soul resounded in everyone's minds, and the shattered soul turned into pure magic power, which appeared in Kali. It became a burning gate of hell. A huge claw stretched out from inside, grabbed Carrie, and pulled her towards the devil's door. The whole process. Gia, who has regained consciousness, did not resist, but just watched everyone quietly like a bloody puppet. Dad, Clark frowned. They signed a soul contract a long time ago and that girl became a demon, Monk said. Snort. An angry voice from the other side of Hell's Gate. But that's it. Shall we wait a little longer? The bald man is back. The gate of hell quickly shrunk and disappeared, but before it disappeared completely, Carrie reached out and pulled the fallen clothes into the gate of hell. It turns out that the small bookshelves used by book lovers have already been hung up, and now almost everyone is using app. The next moment, the gate of hell turned into a small spark. It disappeared without a trace. Everything fell silent again. The father and son looked at each other, and the eyes of the three brothers turned to Monk at the same time. Seeing the smile on Monk's face, the hearts of the three of them cheered up. It was done right this time. Monk praised. Hearing this sentence, the faces of the three brothers showed surprise expressions. Turning around, Monk said to the three, let's go back to school, you know what to do next. All three nodded, and Clark said to Charles, let's go, I'll take you back. Charles and Eric were about to stretch out their hands, but they hurriedly backed away. I asked Eric to take me back. Eric nodded. Advertisement. Clark said, don't worry, I can't run fast. Charles and Eric looked at each other and nodded. Clark clasped their armpits with one hand, and the sound of footsteps disappeared. Ah! Two shouts resounded through the sky, and they walked along the road. Seeing the disappearing three people, Monk couldn't help laughing. 0. The kids grow up. Both the ability and the ability to solve problems have made great progress. There's one thing about this Mephisto that's pretty annoying, though. As the Lord of Hell, Mephisto is very powerful in Hell, but after leaving Hell, his power will become weaker and weaker as time goes by. He himself realizes this, so he always stays in Hell as his body, using his doppelganger. Doppelganger is very powerful, to arrange actions and collect souls. Fortunately, the other party just used the doppelganger to cause trouble, so it wasn't difficult to deal with. But I heard that these children belong to the type of school bullies, and many people who have been bullied by them can't help laughing when they hear about it. The children were picked up one by their parents. The parents were very distressed when they saw the injured child 2.0, but fortunately their child was still alive, unlike the few unfortunate children who had been suffocated. Monk was preparing dinner for the evening as they drove home. However, the instigator of all this, they remember clearly. Then I lost consciousness. On the other hand, the three of Clark returned to the school dance and became giants in the dark crowd. After the police asked them a few questions, the Clark family of three left. Charles was doing well, and it didn't take long for them to wake up one by one. Are you hungry? Monk turned to the three and said, wash your hands first, then eat. Clark and Eric washed their hands obediently. Monk turned around and kicked Charles, who was stealing food, and said, get out and wash your hands. When the police asked what happened in the gymnasium, all the comatose people were a little dazed. They remembered very little, except that they were hit by an invisible force. Charles hummed and hurried into the bathroom. It's delicious. Charles was full of praise, walked to the kitchen, and shouted happily, wonton. At this point, a map appeared in his hand, turned into a light spot, and Monk's body flashed and disappeared. It was their father who knew them too well to know that they would be hungry after the fight. In the end, what happened? But when they turned around, the girl was nowhere to be found, so they let the victim go and reported the incident to authorities. Carly, the girl who was doused in blood like a demon. Advertisement. Chapter 553 Always You. Advertisement. All three drank the soup in their bowls, and Clark sighed contentedly. Marvelous. Eric burped and said to Monk, Dad, this is so delicious, what if I can't eat this when I go to college? As soon as the voice fell, Clark was stunned. Yes, what should he do? After this summer, he will go to college. What should he do? What do you do when you come back from dinner? Clark thought a little confused. Monk snorted, put the dishes away, and said, I'll feel better when you all get out of here. All three burst into tears. Charles suddenly said with a sad face, by the way, Dad. You probably don't know what happened tonight. After speaking, he blinked at Clark. Clark froze for a moment and said, you. Eric patted Clark on the shoulder and said, good job. Clark blushed, but a girl named Louie flashed through his mind. Hey, Charles grinned, there's a girl dancing with Clark at 10, Daddy, I bet you didn't think of that. Monk responded with a dry cough, and went to the kitchen with the bowl. He didn't even have to think about it. Those three silly kids thought he was on the first floor, but they didn't expect him to be on the 5th floor. Dad, your reaction is very strange. Charles looked at Monk suspiciously. The corner of Monk's eyes twitched, and he took a step forward and said, strange. What's weird? Logically, upon hearing this, you should happily go to 8 trigrams and ask who is that girl. Such erratic wit. Monk smiled secretly, but without changing his face, he said calmly, with Clark's appearance, it's normal for girls to ask him out. Why should I be surprised? I thought it was you, who made such a fuss. Ha ha. Eric looked at Charles with mocking eyes. After a pause, Monk asked Clark, what's the girl's name? Charles and Eric also looked at Clark curiously. Clark stood up, frowning and said, just a dance, I didn't ask her name, I'm going to bed. After saying this, Clark quickly went upstairs. Charles and Eric shrugged. Advertisement. Monk's mouth twitched. Hey, this guy can really lie. I haven't asked the name yet. Go to bed, he said to Charles and Eric as he walked toward the kitchen. The two smiled and opened the door and went upstairs. Watching the three of them disappear from sight, Monk let out a long sigh of relief. They must not know about this matter, it will be fermented in his stomach for a lifetime. Due to the horrific events at school yesterday and with the end of term only a few days away, school has just returned for the summer holidays. This means that Clark officially ended his studies. The three children decided to go on a trip together. Is it? Yes, is it 3? No, Monk. Monk looked at the three people who were discussing in full swing. His forehead kept rippling. After the discussion between the three, Monk looked at everyone with a smile and put his hands together. He said, travel, do you have money? All three were stunned, looking at Monk together. Charles giggled and said, Dad, you're going to give us the money, aren't you? Snort. Monk grinned and said, have you thought too much? Think for yourself. No. Eric's eyes widened and he said, Dad, are you that cruel? Clark asked, do you want us to take you with you? Are you taking me? Monk grinned. He patted his pocket and said, just kidding. Just kidding. I have money. I can go wherever I want. Need you to take me. After listening. Hey, makes sense. Ahem. Charles made a face and said, is that Dad? You're taking us on a trip. I didn't. Monk shook his head and said, go to work to make money. It's a long vacation anyway. Oh, yes, you reminded me. Monk patted his forehead and said, I'm going to travel tomorrow. The three of you will go to work first, and then travel after earning money. All three were stunned. Monk grimaced and left the room with a sigh of relief. He is a man of his word. Look what these three guys do. The three people in the room stared wide-eyed and had headaches. Papa seems to be angry, Eric said with some concern. Advertisement. Clark held his chin and said, it's okay, we need to give him some dating space. If he can't find someone, he has no one. Eric nodded with embarrassment, looked at Charles. Why didn't you say it? Charles propped his chin on his hand. I was thinking, how can we get the money faster? Clark said sternly, don't use your superpowers for this. Charles waved his hand and said thoughtfully, you don't have to say such things, Dad will slap me if he finds out. Don't tell me, I just had an idea, and I forgot it as soon as you messed it up. Clark and Eric looked at each other, staring at Charles curiously. After a while, Charles's eyes lit up, and he whispered his thoughts to the two of them. Clark and Eric looked at each other, does this seem feasible? All three nodded, and decided to wait until Monk left and start tomorrow. Outside the door, Monk rubbed his head, waited for a while but the three left, and sighed softly. This kid is really growing up and getting smarter. He was a little lost. But it's only a matter of time. It has been a long time since no one came out to play. Monk smiled happily, already thinking about where to go. Coulson. Monk. Early the next morning, Monk left several people at the airport. Before the plane took off, he called the three people. They said they could make money soon, and then they went on a trip. As soon as the voice fell, he hung up the phone and looked out the window. Just then, something happened. Monk smiled and said, good luck, guys. He turned his head nervously to look, but saw an old man with a soft smile and a kind face looking at him. If anything, it's that the hairline has grown a bit higher and looks more and more dangerous. No. Coulson looked at his seat and said, what a coincidence, I'm sitting next to you. Coulson. Monk smiled and nodded, but he was thinking about throwing Coulson off the plane. Well, that's how Monk described it again. What AF ****** G fate. Monk, are you going to Hawaii? Monk's smile froze slightly. Monk's eyes were wide open, the corners of his mouth twitched and he said, no, I'll skydive soon. A surprised voice came, and Monk blushed. Advertisement. Chapter 554, Coulson's Theorem. Advertisement. Coulson is the last person Monk wants to meet on his travels. Things go wrong when traveling. Sure enough, when the plane followed a straight trajectory through the clouds toward the ocean and Monk's destination, Hawaii, they were hijacked. Confidence again. Monk watched 5 people threatening everyone on the plane with weapons, the corners of his eyes twitched slightly, and he looked at Coulson beside him. You didn't make a broom out of lost hair, did you, broom? Coulson looked at Monk suspiciously and thought, are you going to make a move? He knew that Monk was not an ordinary person, even more powerful than he had imagined before. As a close friend of Nick Fury, he already knew some information about Monk from Nick Fury. When he learned the information about Monk, especially the information about the Thunder team, he was very shocked. You can handle this yourself. Monk didn't dare to say that. Look, I knew something was going to happen. Monk muttered to himself, and looked back at the gangsters. Hijacking. Do you have a parachute? If you don't get off the plane, you will be arrested. I get it, it's not a problem. Coulson looked at the robbers, noticed where they were standing, thought about the solution, and said to Monk, now, if I missed something, you can help. The space inside the plane is small, and there are passengers all around, so if you are not careful, you will hurt people. Coulson is confident to deal with the gangsters, but he is not sure he will not hurt people. At this moment, one of the robbers came over with a gun in his hand, and lightly tapped on the seat in front of the two of them. After the person sitting in front trembled in fright, he smiled with satisfaction and turned his head to rush. Monk and the two sneered, and said angrily, now it's your turn, you two, hand over all the valuables on your body. Otherwise, I will blow your heads off. Don't be nervous, we are obedient. Coulson smiled lightly, making the robber unconsciously relax his vigilance. When Monk saw it, he couldn't help being stunned. You see, it's Coulson's face that is deceiving. That old man over there. What's your expression? You look down on me. That old man. Monk tilts his head to his interlocutor and says, are you talking to me? An old man. He is only 48 years old. Old man. Are you kidding me? The gangster pointed a gun at Monk's head. Advertisement. The corner of Monk's eye twitched. He stretched out his hand, turned around, grabbed the man's hand holding the gun without thinking, and twisted. Amid the gangster's yells, Monk grabbed his opponent's head and slammed into the seat. The next second, when other gangsters looked in that direction, the gun in Monk's hand disappeared, and the gun in Monk's hand rang. With several gunshots, Monk rewarded the gunman with a lot of bullets. Monk hates having a gun to his head. Are there screams? The passengers on the plane were taken aback, but after realizing that it was the robbers who had attacked, they became eerily quiet again. See the two gangsters still hiding between the passenger seats. Want to pick up the gun on the ground. A gunshot, and Coulson, who has been displaced, appeared in front of them. He threw them to the ground with 3 punches and 2 feet, and he pointed the gun at the other 2 gangsters, and said coldly, you twitch again. I'll shoot. Both gangsters tensed up. Is hijacking so dangerous? Did the passengers cheer? The 5 gangsters were all tied up. Coulson and Monk became heroes, and they were praised on the plane. Offered to apply for the Medal of Honor for them. Monk didn't care about it, but his heart felt a lot easier. What must have happened when you and Coulson met? This time, I think it's just hijacking, and it's over. After getting through this hurdle, I was relieved. Leaving Coulson to deal with those who came to thank him out of gratitude, Monk closed his eyes and lay down to rest. Coulson took a good look at Monk and smiled. Monk is still his lucky star. The plane crossed the ocean and landed in Honolulu, Hawaii, or Honolulu. As soon as he landed from the plane, Monk couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. The temperature here is very comfortable, much calmer than New York. Coulson patted Monk on the shoulder and said gratefully, "Let's go, I'll treat you to dinner, thank you so much for being on the plane just now. Son, you have a future." Monk looked at Coulson with a half smile. According to Coulson's theorem, they have already survived one crisis, so the second time will be fine. They walked towards the airport exit together. Feeling the sun and sea breeze, Monk said, "Are you here for vacation this time? Or? Well, it's actually a small task Fury asked me to do. Don't say anything about the mission. Advertisement." Monk didn't listen to him at all, and gave Coulson a meaningful sneer, and said, "The mission was a success, so I'd better not talk about such a confidential matter, so as not to be silenced." Coulson looked at Monk bitterly and said, "You're exaggerating. Fury and I have said it before. I beat him. Backquote beat him." Coulson looked at Monk suspiciously, seemingly unaware of what this was all about. Monk coughed slightly and looked away. "Oh, what did he say?" "He said you were a trustworthy person and a good friend of his." The corner of Meng's mouth twitched and said, "I didn't ask anything." He looked around and said, "Want to eat there? It's dusk now, and it's a good time to go to a specialty restaurant. Hawaii is an island of mixed races, mainly composed of European whites, beautiful Chinese and new people, so there are many special restaurants." Yoshida Teruya. The two took a taxi and drove to the destination Coulson told them. Neon lights. Coulson smiled. "I just came to pass me something, pick me up by the way, nothing else, don't worry." Monk picked up the sunglasses and said, "Let's go. Do you need an appointment?" Monk narrowed his eyes and said, "Coulson, why does this store need an appointment? And the name you just mentioned, who is he?" Coulson shook his head and clarified, "I didn't make an appointment, it was the person I told you just now who asked me to meet here." Monk looked at the building in front of him and raised his eyebrows slightly. A few minutes later, they got out of the car outside the restaurant. Monk gasped and looked at Coulson suspiciously. "Coulson, so you are such a person. I misread you." Seeing Monk and Coulson approaching, he asked politely, "Sir, do you have an appointment?" Coulson looked at the time and said, "Come with me, I know a neon restaurant that has good food." Coulson nodded and called a name. Said and winked at Monk, "I don't need to pay." The woman nodded and made a gesture of invitation to lead Joanne in. The restaurant is hung with neon dishes, and the receptionist at the door is blonde but Lee's in a kimono. "Why did you bring me here to meet?" Advertisement. Chapter 555 Atheist. Advertisement. In the private room. Monk sat down at a low table and looked around at the people who were hosting Coulson. He looked about 40 years old, not tall, not even 1.7 meters tall, but not thin, with a few eighths of a beard hanging on his upper lip, and sharp eyes. Coulson nodded at him, stared at Monk curiously, and explained, "Mr. Yoshida, this is Monk." Yoshida Teruya nodded to Monk, clapped his hands, waited for the waiter outside to open the door, and leaned over slightly. "Serve." Yoshida Teruji turned to Coulson. "Sir, is this your first time here?" Coulson nodded. Masao Yoshida said, "It took us a lot of effort to get this thing, you." Coulson said calmly, "Don't worry, the money will be in your account shortly." Teruya Yoshida smiled and chatted with Coulson. He also knew that among the two of them, Coulson was the person in charge. Monk ignored his interlocutor's indifference, but looked around the room with interest. His eyes turned around and fell on something wrapped in black cloth beside Akio Yoshida. Is this what Coulson came for? This looks like an ordinary 793 transaction, and Coulson has said that the person does not know that he is from S.H.I.E.L.D. Having said that, Coulson is too stingy. They said they wanted to invite him to dinner, but instead of inviting him, they brought him over to wipe. Soon, the waiter appeared with the dishes. All neon specialties. Variety of sashimi, sushi and more. The taste is not bad, but a bit bland for Monk. It's better to eat a hot pot. Monk scolded himself in his heart, and put another piece of sushi into his mouth. Go out and find something else to eat later. Monk decided with a blank face. Coulson and another person chatted while eating, drinking, and Monk raised his glass to express his approval from time to time, and ate to his heart's content. After drinking for 3 rounds, Coulson and Toshio Yoshida looked a little drunk, and they finally started talking about business. Yoshida Teruya made a phone call, confirmed that the funds had arrived, smiled and took out something wrapped in black cloth, and handed it to Coulson. Coulson opened the black cloth. Inside is a black box with incomprehensible patterns on the body and a strange shape, like a miniature coffin. Advertisement. Monk was puzzled. What is this? He is a little curious. Coulson put his hand on the box and was about to open it when Toshio Yoshida's face changed drastically and he said, "Don't open it." With trembling hands, Coulson said, "How can you tell the real from the fake if you don't open it? Distinguish between true and false." Akio Yoshida sharply replied, by the time you can distinguish between the real and the fake, you will already be a corpse. Coulson frowned, and Monk looked at the black box curiously. What the hell is this? Akio Yoshida couldn't help but said. I advise you, don't open that thing, it's evil and dangerous. Coulson was momentarily at a loss for words. They bought it for research. If you don't open it first to see if it's true or not, how can you do it? Seeing that Coulson didn't quite believe that he would open it at any time, Akio Yoshida hurriedly stood up and said, if you really want to open it, you can talk about it after I leave. Putting on his coat, he took out 2 room cards and said, this is the hotel room card, so I won't accompany you. Mr. Yoshida, Coulson looked at the interlocutor and said coldly, if this thing is fake, you must understand that we will find you easily. Don't worry, it won't be fake. Yoshida took a step back, then turned and left. Watching this scene, Coulson shook his head. Is it that scary? What's wrong? Monk asked. Coulson pinched the box and said, I don't know, but I heard there were some documents in it. Documents? Monk asked. What's so scary about that? Coulson shrugged and said, who knows, but there are rumors that people who see it will die in mysterious ways. So cool. That's just a legend, there is no evidence. Coulson smiled lightly. Apparently Bafe did not believe these rumors. If you don't believe it, then why did you shield by it? I don't believe it, but people who want to study it do. As Coulson spoke, he was about to open the box. Monk frowned and reminded. I don't think that guy is pretending, that thing may be really dangerous. Coulson said with a smile. Isn't it just a box and a folder, what danger can there be? The man winked at Monk and said, I'm an atheist, and rumors like this don't scare me. Monk finished drinking the wine in the glass and stood up. Okay, I'm leaving, you guys chat slowly. Advertisement. Regardless of whether the rumors were true or not, he didn't want to read the documents inside. It was the information of S.H.I.E.L.D., so don't cause trouble if you read it. Personal relationship with S.H.I.E.L.D. is fine, but in business, forget it. Leaving Coulson alone in the room, Monk left the private room to get some fresh air outside. It was just as night fell, and there were more and more people on the street, which was more lively than when Monk came during the day. Sunshine, sand, beautiful scenery. Monk smiled, thinking of a better tomorrow. This is life. But what happened to those 3 boys? The unsettling thought slipped out of Monk's mind before his attention was drawn to the people coming and going on the road. Heck, what a beach. Monk thought about it, and decided to find a place to have a few drinks and see if there was a suitable person to spend this lonely night with him. Meanwhile, Coulson opened up the black box. As soon as he opened it, Coulson felt a bone-piercing chill, suppressed and shuddered. What's the situation? The photo is pressed from above. The children look cute, and the faces of men and women are ripped off. Coulson picked up the photo and looked at it. It was a photo that was torn apart and then spliced together. There were 3 people in the photo, a man, a woman and a child. Nothing special, just 2 ordinary documents, which he couldn't read at all, because he knew very limited neon characters. Is this a family? B. Coulson frowned, stuffed the folder into the drawer, and locked it again. Coulson grumbled and opened the box. Inside was a photograph and several sheets of paper stacked together. Coulson frowned, and was about to put away the photo, when he was surprised to find that the child in the photo had already kicked his legs, and the woman whose face had been torn off also appeared, with a pale face and a dull expression. Coulson looked puzzled, but as a deeply convinced atheist, he didn't care. Instead, he took the contents of the box in his hands and began to look at them. Coulson threw away the photo subconsciously, and when he opened his eyes to look again, nothing had changed. Let's leave these things to the people in the bureau. Putting the photo aside, Coulson picked up the file and flipped through it. What's the name of this woman? Blurred vision. I am an atheist. Coulson muttered to himself, feeling a little uneasy in his heart. Advertisement.